Hi, I'm Yukari Alice.
And I am Yukuri Pachuli. In today's video, part 2, we are going to focus on how to master the historical documents and short questions for exams and university entrance preparation of Spanish Bachillerato. This video took hours to compile, so I haven't rewatched it from start to end. It may contain errors. Thank you for your attention. Now, let's get going. Unit 1. Point 1. Explain the way of life of Paleolithic societies.
Paleolithic societies lived in cold climates and enjoyed a predatory economy. They dedicated themselves to hunting, fishing, and gathering. They were nomads and moved seasonally, following food and herds of herbivores. At a social level, they were divided into clans of 12 to 15 members with a very rudimentary tribal organization. When they mastered fire, they began to inhabit caves permanently. During the Paleolithic period, 3 periods are distinguished: the Lower Paleolithic, Homo antecessor and Homo heidelbergensis, the Middle Paleolithic, Homo neanderthalensis, and the Upper Paleolithic, Homo sapiens. The tools, very rudimentary, were carved in stone, very simple at first, choppers and chopping tools, which evolves into hand axes of different typologies.
2. Explain what types of tools were made in the Lower Paleolithic.
During the Paleolithic, our ancestors developed a series of tools that allowed them to survive and thrive in a hostile environment. One of the most important innovations of this era was the creation of the first stone utensils. These utensils were made from carved stones, such as flint, and were used for a wide variety of tasks, such as cutting, craping, piercing, and crushing. Their invention marked a milestone in human history, as it allowed our ancestors to improve their efficiency and adapt to different environments. Very crude tools were used, choppers and chopping tools at the very beginning. Choppers consist of instruments carved on a pebble or small block of stone that has been roughly carved on one side, forming an edge on the other side, while chopping tools have a double edge. Little by little, they evolved into hand axes of various shapes and typologies: triangular, cordiform, or amygdaloidal. They produced them by striking stones against each other to shape them or to give them sharp edges, using techniques such as the so-called napping, lascado, which consisted of striking one stone with another to detach flakes and shape the paste. Desired utensil. Hand axes were used for cutting meat, processing food, and making other utensils.
3. Explain the most important characteristics of Neanderthal man.
Neanderthal man, known scientifically as Homo neanderthalensis, was a human species that inhabited Europe, the Near East, and parts of Asia between about 200,000 and 40,000 years ago. It was characterized by having a robust and compact body with short limbs and a wide thorax, which allowed it to resist the cold climates of the glacial era. Their average height was around 1.60 meters, although what stood out most was their physical strength, superior to that of Homo sapiens. Regarding their cranial morphology, they presented an elongated skull, a low forehead, prominent supraorbital ridges, and a wide nose that allowed them to heat the air, as well as other traits that are also related to adaptation to cold environments. They lacked a defined chin, but their brain capacity was very high, even larger on average than that of modern humans, reaching around 1,500 cubic centimeters. They knew fire and practiced funerary rites, and the first works of art and symbolic elements are even attributed to them. Their extinction is a mystery today, and is related to them being left without the capacity to reproduce or being unable to adapt to the new climatic features.
4. Explain the key differences between Paleolithic and Neolithic paintings.
The differences are structured around 2 large artistic currents: Cantabrian rock art, Upper Paleolithic, and Levantine rock art, Epipaleolithic and Neolithic. Location and habitat. Paleolithic paintings are located in the north of the peninsula, Cantabrian Cornice, and were carried out inside deep and dark caves. Neolithic and Levantine paintings are located in the Mediterranean Arch and are found in open-air or shallow rock shelters. Theme and composition. Paleolithic art is figurative and focuses on large animals, bisons, horses, deer, drawn in isolation, superimposed, and without forming instructive or narrative scenes. Neolithic Levantine art has a marked narrative character, where the human figure is the protagonist, forming scenes of daily life, hunts, combats, ritual dances, or hunting-gathering. Technique and style. Paleolithic paintings stand out for their naturalism. They take advantage of the protrusions of the rock to give volume and apply color gradations, being predominantly polychrome, blacks, and a wide range of ochres. In contrast, the Neolithic style tends toward the stylization and schematization of shapes. They are flat and monochrome, figures that use fixed colors, red or black. Meaning, Paleolithic art is associated with magical motivations to favor hunting or fertility rituals in sanctuary caves. The subsequent art of the Neolithic moves away from that technical mysticism to reflect the collective activities of the community.
Point 5. Explain the features of the Neolithic economy.
The Neolithic meant a radical transformation by shifting from a predatory economy to a food-producing economy based on the development of agriculture and livestock. Sedentary lifestyle and surplus. The domestication of plants and animals forced human populations to adopt a sedentary lifestyle, creating the first stable villages. The increase in agricultural productivity generated the accumulation of a food surplus. Specialization of labor. As the entire population did not have to dedicate itself to looking for food, the division of labor arose. The first specialized artisan workshops appeared where new techniques were developed, such as polished stone to manufacture agricultural tools, axes, hoes, sickles, the production of textiles, and the elaboration of pottery to store excess food. Social complexity. The control and appropriation of agricultural surpluses led to the appearance of the first social elites. Society became clearly stratified, giving rise to producing classes, the hierarchization of power, and slavery. This social change is confirmed archaeologically by the presence of unequal grave goods and prestige objects in the tombs of the period. Point 6. Explain the key features of the Tartessian civilization. The culture of Tartessos developed in the southwest of the peninsula, specifically in the lower valley of the Guadalquivir and on the coasts of western Andalusia, representing the most advanced core of the pre-Roman stage. First state of the peninsula. It is considered the first formal state organization of the Iberian Peninsula. Being mentioned in biblical sources and by Greek chroniclers, its original historical reality is closely linked to myth, highlighting the story about its longest Thesmades Ved monarch, King Arganthonios 8th 6th centuries B.C. Economic structure. Its wealth was based on its position as a major center of international trade. They exploited the mining characteristic of the area, especially silver and tin, which they actively exchanged with Phoenician and Greek colonizers. This commercial activity was complemented by a solid base of agriculture, livestock, and fishing. Society and habitat. Politically, they were organized under a monarchy. Society was strongly divided by level of wealth, as evidenced by archaeological findings of luxury goldsmithing, ivories, and precious bronzes, with the treasure of El Carambolo, Seville, being the maximum exponent. Although their exact urban nuclei of habitation remain under investigation, the archaeological record demonstrates the existence of sanctuaries and artisan workshops that reflect a deep cultural hybridization with the currents of the Eastern Mediterranean.
Point 7. Explain the art that develops during the Age of Metals.
The artistic development of this period was directly conditioned by the birth of metallurgy and the increase in social complexity through three main phases: the Copper Age, Chalcolithic, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age, monumental architecture, and megalithism. Large stone structures with ritual and funerary functions continued and were perfected. Menhirs, elongated monoliths driven vertically into the ground to mark sacred places or crossroads, and dolmens, structures formed by large vertical slabs supporting a horizontal slab intended for collective burials, stand out. In the field of defensive urbanism, fortifications, burial mounds, and walled settlements on high ground gained great importance. Craftsmanship and pottery. In the artisan realm, the most characteristic element was the bell beaker during the Chalcolithic. This pottery, with an inverted bell shape and profuse geometric decoration, became an object of luxury and prestige that formed part of the grave goods of local elites. Metallurgy and prestige objects. The ability to melt metals, first copper, then the bronze alloy, and finally iron, allowed the manufacturing of much more durable and elaborate tools, weapons, and personal adornment elements. Pieces such as fibulae, safety pins, necklaces, bracelets, and decorated swords not only had a utilitarian or military function, but acted as symbols of power, wealth, and social status, both in daily life and in funerary grave goods.
Point 8. Explain the most significant features of the Celts.
The Celts were a group of peoples of Indo-European origin who penetrated through the Pyrenees in successive waves, starting in the 8th century B.C., settling in the central, western, and northwestern regions of the Iberian Peninsula. Habitat and urbanism. Their characteristic form of settlement was the castros. These were fortified and walled villages built in elevated or strategic areas to facilitate defense. The dwellings in the castros presented a predominantly circular morphology with stone walls and thatch roofs. Economic structure. Their subsistence model was eminently rural, based on an agro-pastoral economy where livestock and rain-fed agriculture predominated. Likewise, they were expert connoisseurs of bronze metallurgy and, very prominently, iron forging, which allowed them to manufacture high-quality weapons and resistant agricultural implements. Social organization and culture. Their society possessed a marked warrior character and was organized at a local level into structures of clans and tribes united by kinship ties. Religiously, they worshipped the forces of nature and relied on the figure of the Druids as spiritual leaders and priests. Their funerary rites included cremation and the subsequent deposition of ashes in urns, urnfield culture.
9. Explain the features of the Iberians.
The Iberians were an amalgam of indigenous peoples who occupied the entire Mediterranean coastal strip and the southern peninsula, from Catalonia to Andalusia. Between the 5th and 3rd centuries B.C., born from the evolution of local cultures under the influence of Eastern colonizers. Habitat and politics. They resided in heavily fortified settlements called oppida, built on elevated terrain to optimize their defense. These enclaves functioned autonomously as city-states, controlling a surrounding agricultural territory. Open economy. Their economic base combined cereal agriculture, olives, vines, and sheep or goat livestock. Unlike the Celts, they maintained active commercial contact with Phoenicians, Greeks, and Carthaginians. This external influence prompted decisive innovations such as the use of currency, the potter's wheel, and the development of their own writing system. Social structure and artistic manifestations. Their society was rigidly hierarchical, dominated by a warrior aristocracy and a priestly class. They stood out extraordinarily in monumental stone sculpture linked to the funerary and religious realm, of which the Lady of Elche or the Lady of Baza are their maximum exponents. In the funerary field, they generally practiced cremation, depositing the ashes in underground chambers along with rich grave goods and offerings.
10. Explain the legacy of the colonizing peoples.
Starting in the first millennium BC, the Iberian Peninsula received the arrival of Mediterranean colonizing currents that transformed the structures of the indigenous peoples, culminating in the subsequent total integration of the territory into the Roman Empire starting in 218 before Christ. The Phoenicians, coming from the eastern Mediterranean, they founded the first coastal factories in the southern peninsula, such as Gar, Cadiz, or Malacca Malaga. Their main legacy was the introduction of alphabetic writing, the spread of the potter's wheel, advanced metallurgy with alloys, and loom textile production. They also contributed navigation and fish salting techniques, in addition to a deep orientalizing imprint on Iberian sculpture. The Greeks, established mainly in the northeast of the Mediterranean coast, they founded colonies such as Emporion, Ampurius. Their great contribution was the introduction and spread of the use of currency, the boost of large-scale trade, and the transmission of their artistic values, pottery techniques, and urban models. The Carthaginians, coming from North Africa, they continued the Phoenician influence and consolidated commercial and military colonies in the south and east of the peninsula, such as Carthago Nova. They perfected metallurgy, expanded trade routes, and systematically introduced Mediterranean crops like the olive and the vine. Their strong military presence in the peninsula ended up causing a direct confrontation with Rome in the Punic Wars. The Romans, their legacy was the deepest and most durable, completely transforming the peninsular structure. They unified the territory under a solid legal and administrative system, Roman law, and founded large cities, Tarraco, Emerita, Augusta. They developed an immense network of infrastructures that included roads, bridges, and aqueducts, and implemented Latin as the official language, which served as the matrix for future Romance languages. Likewise, they reorganized the economic exploitation of mining and large-scale agriculture.
11. Explain the concept of Romanization and the elements that favored it.
Romanization is the historical process through which the indigenous peoples of the Iberian Peninsula fully assumed and integrated the economic, social, political, legal, and cultural structures of Rome. This phenomenon meant the progressive disappearance of native ways of life and their replacement by the Roman model, culturally unifying the territory. The main elements that favored and accelerated this process were the infrastructure and city network, the construction of an extensive network of roads, bridges, and aqueducts, facilitated territorial interconnection, boosted trade, and speeded up military and administrative control. Cities acted as the main centers of irradiation of Roman life. The legal administrative organization, the implementation of Roman law provided the territory with a unified, stable, and predictable legal framework, which incentivized the voluntary assimilation of local elites who sought to obtain Roman citizenship. The common economic structure. The integration of Hispania into the commercial circuits of the empire boosted mining, crafts, and agricultural production, especially of cereal, oil, and wine, linking indigenous economic interests with those of Rome. Cultural and linguistic unification. The widespread adoption of Latin as a common language eliminated communication barriers. To this was added the assimilation of Roman religion, and later Christianity, customs, clothing, and public spectacles. Military and colonist presence. Roman army camps and the settlement of veteran soldiers who were given land upon discharge functioned as constant sources of direct contact and cultural transmission. 12. Describe Visigothic society and political organization. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the Visigothic kingdom established a unitary state in the Iberian Peninsula, with its capital in Toledo, developing a process of legal, territorial, and religious homogenization between the Germanic and Hispano-Roman populations. Political organization. The elective monarchy. The system of government was an elective monarchy where the king was designated by the nobility. This generated great internal instability and frequent overthrows. The monarchs achieved territorial unification through military campaigns led by kings such as Leovigild, who defeated the Sube in 585, and Suintila, who definitively expelled the Byzantines in 625. In addition to subduing the northern peoples, Vascones, Cantabri, and Astures. Institutions of government. The monarch governed with the support of two key institutions. The Aula Regia, a consultative council made up of the high nobility, magnates, and the king's closest collaborators to advise him on political and military tasks. The councils of Toledo, assemblies of ecclesiastical origin presided over by the king which, after religious unification, became authentic legislative bodies where binding political and state decisions were made. Legal and religious unification. To cohesion the kingdom, two far-reaching reforms were carried out. Religious unification in the year 589, when King Record converted to Catholicism, abandoning Arianism, and legal unification in 654, when King Requeswinth promulgated the Liber Iudiciorum, or Fuero Juzgo, which imposed a single common law for Gothic and Hispano-Roman subjects. Social structure. Visigothic society presented a rigidly hierarchical structure with a strong embedding of personal dependence bonds. The elites privileged. At the top were the king and the warrior nobility, landowners and military chiefs who controlled large estates along with the high hierarchy of the church, bishops, and clerics, which accumulated enormous political, economic, and educational power. Free men, independent peasants, small landowners, and artisans who were in charge of producing goods and cultivating the land. Servants and coloni, non-free. The working base of society consisting of peasants obligatorily attached to the lands of the large feudal lords, lacking full personal freedom.
Unit 2, Part 1. Explain the causes of the Muslim invasion of the peninsula.
The Muslim conquest of the Iberian Peninsula in the year 711 and the beginning of Al-Andalus falls within the general expansion of Islam, but it was favored by the extreme weakness of the Visigothic kingdom. Succession disputes. A civil war pitted the factions of King Don Rodrigo against the supporters of Adjuladu, who facilitated the entry of the Muslims into the peninsula as allies. Socioeconomic crisis. A situation of generalized poverty and strong social tension between a landowner minority and a large mass of discontented peasants and slaves. Policy of pacts. The rapid submission was achieved through capitulations, pacts, with the Visigothic nobility and the population, guaranteeing that they could maintain their assets and religion in exchange for the payment of taxes.
Point 2. Briefly explain the political evolution that Islam followed until the stage of the Taifa kingdoms.
Al-Andalus went through three major political stages before its fragmentation. Dependent Emirate, 714-756. The territory was a province of the Umayyad Caliphate and was governed by an emir subordinated to Damascus. Independent Emirate, 756-929. Following the slaughter of the Umayyads in the east, the survivor Abd al-Rahman I arrived in the peninsula and proclaimed himself an independent emir, in political terms, from the new capital, Baghdad. It was a turbulent stage due to internal revolts among Arabs, Berbers, and Muladis. Caliphate of Cordoba, 929-1031. Abd al-Rahman III self-proclaimed himself caliph, breaking also the religious submission to Baghdad. It was the period of maximum military, economic, and cultural apogee, continued by al-Hakam II. It ended up collapsing into a civil war, fitna, that disintegrated Andalusi unity into multiple Taifa kingdoms.
3. Briefly explain Andalusi society.
Andalusi society was strongly hierarchical according to religious and ethnic criteria. Muslim community, divided by ethnicity and wealth. Arab aristocracy, a powerful minority, owner of the best lands and holding the main political offices. Berbers, Muslims from North Africa, settled in the mountainous and poorest areas. They formed the base of the army and led constant revolts. Muladis, Hispanic Christians converted to Islam en masse to integrate socially and stop paying special taxes. Non-Muslims, dhimmis, or protected people for paying tributes. Mozarabis, Christians who maintained their faith in Islamic territory. Their numbers decreased due to the persecutions of the 9th century, migrating to the Christian north. Jews, an urban minority actively dedicated to craftsmanship, commerce, and the liberal professions.
4. Explain the cultural and economic legacy of Al-Andalus.
Unlike the Christian north, Al-Andalus organized a brilliant urban and commercial economy. They developed a flourishing irrigated agriculture through ditches and water wheels, introducing oriental crops. Rice, citrus fruits, cotton, saffron. The cities had rich markets, souks, and traded internationally with the rest of the Islamic world. Christian Europe and Central Africa, gold and slaves. Culture. Cordoba became the main intellectual hub of the Western Middle Ages. They introduced Indian numbering, with the zero, algebra, and advancements in astronomy and medicine. In philosophy, Averroes, commentator on Aristotle, and Maimonides stood out. Their peak art was captured in the Mosque of Cordoba and the Alhambra of Granada.
Point 5. Briefly explain the origin and expansion of the North African kingdoms in Al-Andalus.
From the 11th century onward, faced with the military advance of the Christian kingdoms, such as the capture of Toledo in 1085, the weakness of the Taifa kingdoms prompted the intervention of two large Islamic empires from North Africa. The Almoravids, late 11th century, ultra-Orthodox Muslims who temporarily stopped the Christians' defeat of Alfonso VI and unified the Taifas by force under their control, until falling due to Andalusi discontent and Christian pressure. The Almohads, 12th century, they replaced the Almoravids, fixing their capital in Seville. Their dominance collapsed definitively after the great Christian victory at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, 1212. Following this collapse, the Christians conquered almost all of Andalusia, leaving only the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada, 1238 to 1492. As the sole Islamic redoubt, thanks to its diplomacy and the payment of parias, tributes, to Castile.
Point 6. Briefly explain the process of repopulation.
Repopulation was the peaceful occupation and economic organization of lands conquered militarily from the Muslims. It was carried out through 5 major modalities depending on the era and the area. Pressura or appricio, 8th-10th centuries, Drero Valley and Pyrenees. Ownership was granted to the peasant who occupied and cultivated the empty land. It generated small, free peasants. Council repopulation, 11th, 12th centuries. Between the Duero and the Tagus, directed by cities organized through a fuero or town charter, it structured a free, medium-sized property with communal lands. Nobiliary repopulation, 12th century. Aragon. The nobles dominated large agricultural extensions cultivated by a subjected Muslim population, mudehars. Military orders, 12th century. Between the Tagus and the Guadiana, large dangerous frontier extensions delivered to monk soldiers, creating large estates destined for livestock farming. Repartimiento, 13th century. With Alquivir Valley, Valencia, and Murcia, the kings distributed lots of houses and lands among the high nobility and the church as payment for their military aid, consolidating the enormous estates of southern Spain.
Point 7. Briefly define the concept of reconquest.
The reconquest is the ideological and military process developed by the Christian kingdoms of the northern peninsula between the 8th and 15th centuries to annex the territories of Al-Andalus. The concept was coined politically at the Asturian court of Alfonso II, who justified military expansion by legitimizing himself as the rightful heir to the Visigothic monarchy destroyed in 711. The military advance was driven by two ideological engines: the idea of restoring the Visigothic kingdom and the European crusade spirit against Islam.
Briefly explain the evolution of the Kingdom of Asturias.
Origin: it began after the military victory of Pelayo at Covadonga, 722, establishing the center of Asturian resistance around the capital, Oviedo. Consolidation: monarchs like Alfonso II linked the new kingdom with the Visigothic tradition by recovering the legal code, Liberi Judiciorum. During the 9th century, the kingdom expanded southward to the natural frontier of the Duero River. Evolution and independence: at the beginning of the 10th century, Alfonso III moved the capital to Leon, becoming known as the Kingdom of Leon. From its own territorial growth emerged two frontier counties that would end up becoming independent kingdoms. The County of Castile, independent under Fernán González in the 10th century, and a kingdom under Fernando I in the 11th, and the County of Portugal, converted into a kingdom in the 12th century.
9. Briefly describe what the Mesta Association consisted
The
of.
Mesta, officially created by King Alfonso X, the Wise in 1273, under the name of Honrado Conceño de la Mesta, was a powerful royal association that unified and protected the large owners of sheep livestock in Castile, high nobility, and military orders. The Castilian economy depended heavily on transhumant sheep farming, whose herds of merino sheep traveled the peninsula from north to south, along protected pathways called royal cañadas. The Mesta enjoyed immense royal privileges because the export of its wool to Flanders brought great revenues to the crown. This caused livestock interests to be imposed by law over agriculture, expropriating cultivated lands for pastures and harming the economy of the peasants.
Briefly describe the importance of the Toledo School of Translators.
The Toledo School of Translators, developed intensely from the 12th century onward after the Christian conquest of the city, was the great space for cultural and intellectual transfer in the Middle Ages. In it, scholars and intellectuals from the three religions, Christians, Jews, and Muslims, collaborated to translate into Latin and Romance works of Oriental and Arabic origin and, fundamentally, of classical Greek thought, such as Aristotle. During the second half of the 13th century, the school reached its maximum splendor under the direct institutional protection of King Alfonso X the Wise, turning the Iberian Peninsula into the definitive cultural bridge that allowed the intellectual rebirth of Christian Europe.
Point 1. Vial. Explain the origin of the Cortas in the Christian kingdoms and their main functions.
Origin: they were born at the end of the 12th and beginning of the 13th centuries as a response to the economic boom of the cities. The monarchs needed financial resources for their military campaigns and turned to the urban bourgeoisie. In exchange for money, the bourgeois demanded entry into the governing bodies. The first in history were the Cortes of Leon of 1188. Composition: they were formed by three branches or estates: the nobility, the clergy, and the representatives of the cities, bourgeoisie. Functions according to the kingdom: in Castile, they had a mainly advisory character and were summoned to vote on the extraordinary taxes, subsidies, requested by the king. In Aragon and Navarre, they were governed by pactism. The Cortes had true legislative power. The monarch was controlled by the traditional laws of the land, usages, and had to negotiate any new measure or law with the estates.
Point 1. Sith. Explain the differences between the Christian and Muslim economies in the Spanish Middle Ages.
During the Middle Ages, two radically opposed economic models coexisted: the Andalusi economy, urban and commercial. It was a dynamic and advanced model. It stood out for a rich irrigated agriculture, introduction of citrus fruits, rice, saffron, ditches, and intense artisanal manufacturing production in the cities, textiles, leather, and an active foreign trade that connected Al-Andalus with the rest of the Islamic world, Central Africa, and Christian Europe, using a strong monetary economy. The Christian economy, rural and archaic, initially stagnant, It was based on dryland cereal agriculture using rudimentary techniques, Roman plow and biennial rotation with fallow land. Over time, it turned toward transhumant sheep farming through the Mesta, converting the export of raw wool to northern Europe into its main economic engine, to the detriment of internal industrial and agricultural development.
Point 1/3. Explain the characteristics of the artistic styles that penetrated through the Way of St. James.
The Way of St. James functioned as the main axis of communication with Europe, facilitating the successive entry of the two great international styles of Christendom. Romanesque art, 11th–12th centuries, a rural and monastic style. It is characterized by massive, solid, and majestic stone constructions, with thick walls, heavy counterforts, very small windows, the use of the semicircular arch, and the barrel vault. It had a marked didactic and symbolic character. Examples: San Martín de Frombista and the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela. Gothic art, 13th–15th centuries, an urban style driven by the rebirth of cities. It is characterized by the pursuit of luminosity and verticality. Thanks to technical innovations like the pointed or ogival arch, the ribbed vault, and the flying buttresses, the walls stopped supporting all the weight, allowing the opening of immense windows with colored stained glass openings. It presents a much more naturalistic design. Examples: cathedrals of Burgos, Toledo, and León.
Unit 3.1. Briefly explain the foreign policy of the reign of the Catholic monarchs.
The main guidelines of the foreign policy of the Catholic monarchs, 1474, 1/16, were marked by three strategic axes, with the objective of isolating their great rival France and expanding their domains. Italian policy, direct confrontation with France for hegemony in the Italian peninsula. Under the military direction of Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba, the Great Captain, Spanish troops defeated the French, consolidating the control of the Crown of Aragon over the Kingdom of Naples, 1504. North African policy. Following the conquest of Granada, military expeditions were carried out on the northern coast of Africa, occupying outposts such as Melilla, Oran, and Tripoli between 1497 and 1510. The objective was to curb Barbary piracy and contain the threat of the Ottoman Empire in the western Mediterranean. Atlantic expansion. The conquest and occupation of the Canary Islands was completed 1496, which was key for overseas routes. The rivalry with Portugal was resolved through the Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, which drew a dividing line 370 leagues west of Cape Verde, delimiting the American discovery zones for Castile. Matrimonial policy. They designed a network of alliances by marrying their children to the heirs of England, Portugal, and the Holy Roman Empire, Habsburgs, to diplomatically isolate France.
2. Briefly explain the historical importance of the capture of Granada.
The Granada War, 1482–1492, was a 10-year conflict that culminated on January 2, 1492, when the Catholic monarchs took the capital and the last Nasrid king, Boabdil, signed the capitulations of the city. Its historical importance can be summarized in three fundamental aspects. End of the Reconquista. It meant the definitive disappearance of the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada, the last political bastion of Islam in the Iberian Peninsula, putting an end to an 800-year historical process initiated ideologically at the Battle of Covadonga, 722. Territorial unity. It represented a crucial step in the territorial unification of the kingdoms of the peninsula under the same authoritarian monarchy, a process that would later culminate with the annexation of Navarre, 1512, by Ferdinand the Catholic. Religious unification. It was the initial pillar of the project of religious homogeneity of the Catholic monarchs. Although the initial capitulations guaranteed freedom of worship for the Mudéjars, the policy of forced conversions by Cardinal Cisneros ended up provoking the rebellion of the Moriscos and the subsequent decrees of expulsion of the Jews, 1492, and Muslims, 1502.
3. Briefly describe the territories on which the Spanish monarchy was settled during the reign of Charles I and what happened upon the death of the emperor.
In 1516, Charles I of Spain and V of Germany unified by dynastic chance an immense territorial inheritance that made him the most powerful monarch of the era. From his maternal grandparents, the Catholic monarchs, the crowns of Castile and Aragon; from his father, Philip the Handsome, Burgundian inheritance, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Franche-Comté; from his paternal grandfather, Maximilian of Austria, the patrimonial territories of the Habsburgs in Austria and Germany, along with the rights to be elected emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. This heterogeneous empire was kept united under the ideal of the universal monarchy and the defense of Catholicism. Faced with the political and military failure to halt the Protestant Reformation in Germany, Charles V signed the Peace of Augsburg, 1555, and decided to abdicate from power. In the abdications of Brussels, 1556, he divided his domains. He ceded the Austrian territories and the rights to the imperial title to his brother Ferdinand I, and the rest of the Hispanic kingdoms, Flanders, the Italian possessions, and the Indies to his son Philip II. Charles retired to the monastery of Yuste, Cáceres, where he passed away.
Point 4. Briefly explain the most relevant international political conflicts of the major Habsburgs, 16th century.
The foreign policy of Charles I and Philip II was oriented toward maintaining European hegemony and defending Catholicism as an ideological principle, the Universitas Christiana with Charles I and the Counter-Reformation with Philip II. They faced three major focal points of conflict. France, traditional dynastic enemy for the control of Italy. Charles I achieved the annexation of the Duchy of Milan after the Battle of Pavia, 1525. Philip II definitively consolidated this hegemony in Europe by crushing the French at the Battle of St. Quentin, 1557. Ottoman Empire, constant struggle in the Mediterranean to halt Turkish expansion. Charles I defended Vienna and captured Tunis. Philip II allied with Venice and the papacy in the Holy League, achieved the great naval victory at the Battle of Lepanto, 1571. Protestantism and the Rebellion of Flanders, the main problem of both reigns. Charles I fought in Germany against the Protestant princes, victory at Mühlberg, 1547, but had to accept the religious division in the Peace of Augsburg, 1555. Under Philip II, the conflict moved to the 80 Years' War, 1568, where the deep roots of Calvinism and desires for autonomy triggered a rebellion. The harsh repression by the Duke of Alba did not prevent the split of the territory between the United Provinces, the Protestant North, and the Spanish Netherlands, the Catholic South. England. Confrontation with Elizabeth I due to her support for the Dutch rebels and the harassment of her privateers in America. It ended in the disaster of the Spanish Armada, 1588.
Point 5. Briefly explain the characteristics of Spanish hegemony in the world during the 16th century.
During the 16th century, the Hispanic monarchy became the primary global hegemonic power. This power was sustained by three fundamental pillars: territorial extension, a global empire that united the crowns of Castile and Aragon, the Italian possessions, Franche-Comté, the Netherlands, and the viceroyalties of America. It reached its zenith with the Iberian Union, 1581, when Philip II incorporated the Kingdom of Portugal and its entire colonial empire. Financial potential. The maintenance of hegemony was possible thanks to the enormous mining exploitation of America, which provided massive shipments of precious metals, gold and silver, via the West Indies fleet to Seville. Military supremacy. Based on a highly efficient professional infantry army, the Spanish tercios, which dominated European battlefields for over a century. However, the financial cost of keeping multiple wartime fronts open in Europe far exceeded the revenues. This generated chronic indebtedness with foreign bankers and triggered successive bankruptcies of the royal treasury under the reign of Philip II, laying the groundwork for the 17th century crisis.
Point 6. Briefly explain the foreign policy of the reign of Philip II.
The foreign policy of Philip II, 1556–1598, abandoned the imperial idea of his father to focus on defending the interests of the Hispanic monarchy and the orthodoxy of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. His main milestones were peace with France. He consolidated Spanish dominance over Italy following the military victory of St. Quentin, 1557, and the signing of the Peace of Cato Cambresis, 1559. Curbing the Turkish Empire, he halted Ottoman maritime expansion in the western Mediterranean through the victory of the Holy League fleet at the Battle of Lepanto, 1571. The Rebellion of the Netherlands, 1568. A conflict provoked by fiscal discontent and the spread of Calvinism. Despite the military campaigns of rulers like the Duke of Alba or Alexander Farnese, the territory split permanently with the North, United Provinces, achieving de facto independence. War against England. Motivated by English support for the Dutch rebels and pirate attacks on American trade, Philip II attempted to invade the islands with the Spanish Armada 1588, whose naval failure dealt a severe blow to Spanish prestige. Annexation of Portugal 1581. Philip II enforced his succession rights after the death of King Sebastian I. He was recognized as king at the Cortes of Tomar 1581, unifying the entire Iberian Peninsula and its respective overseas empires.
Pride, Freshed. Briefly explain the differences in international policy between the reign of Philip II and that of his father, Charles I.
Although both shared the defense of Catholicism and the conservation of their dynastic heritage, their reigns presented marked differences in international policy. Sphere of action. Charles I pursued a European policy with a nomadic profile. He traveled constantly, inspired by the medieval universal monarchy and the Holy Roman Empire. Philip II centralized the government in Castile, fixed the capital of the court in Madrid, 1561, and directed the empire bureaucratically from the palace of El Escorial, prioritizing strictly Hispanic interests. The German problem. Charles I wore himself down combating the Protestant Schmalkaldic League militarily within the Germanic Empire. Philip II remained completely disconnected from the political affairs of the German territories, which passed to the Austrian branch of the Habsburgs. New enemies. Charles I centered his efforts on the wars against the France of Francis I and the Turkish advance. Philip II, although inheriting these conflicts, which he closed at Cateau Cambrésis and Lepanto, had to prioritize the costly and endless war of attrition against the Calvinist rebellion in the Netherlands and direct confrontation against the Anglican England of Elizabeth I. Iberian unity. Philip II achieved the greatest territorial success of the dynasty by annexing the Kingdom of Portugal and its colonies in 1581, a milestone his father was never able to accomplish.
Part 8. Briefly explain what the expression government of the Validos means.
The government of the Validos is a political practice characteristic of the 17th century during the reigns of the minor Habsburgs, Philip III, Philip IV, and Charles II. It consisted of the delegation of governance tasks and the utmost confidence of the crown into the hands of an aristocrat or favorite minister, called a valito or privado, who acted as a de facto head of government. This figure was not a regulated institutional office, but rather their power emanated directly from the friendship and trust of the monarch. The government of the Validos was marked by nepotism, appointing relatives to positions of power, the creation of clientelist networks, and deep administrative corruption. The most influential Validos of the century were the Duke of Lerma, under Philip III, and the Count Duke of Olivares, under Philip IV. Their centralist policies and the squandering of funds worsened the institutional and economic crisis of the Hispanic monarchy in the 17th century.
Briefly describe the main internal political problems faced during the reign of Philip IV.
The reign of Philip IV was dominated by the figure of his velito, the Count Duke of Olivares, whose political program sought to restore Spanish hegemony in Europe, intervening in the 30 Years' War, and centralize the administration. To alleviate the fiscal exhaustion of Castile, Olivares proposed the Union of Arms 1626, a project that aimed to create a permanent army of 140,000 men recruited and financed proportionally by all the kingdoms of the monarchy according to their wealth and population. The Cortes of the Crown of Aragon, especially Catalonia, firmly opposed it for infringing upon their traditional charters, fueros. The fiscal pressure and the demands of the war with France triggered the crisis of 1640, the most critical year of the empire. Rebellion of Catalonia, 1640. The presence of royal tercios in Catalan territory sparked protests that culminated in the Corpus de Sangre, June 1640, where revoltant peasants assassinated the viceroy in Barcelona. The Generalitat broke ties with Madrid and handed the sovereignty of the principality over to the King of France. The civil conflict lasted until the surrender of Barcelona to the troops of Philip IV in 1652, resulting in an agreement to respect the Catalan fueros. Rebellion and independence of Portugal, 1640. Dissatisfaction among the Portuguese nobility and bourgeoisie over the lack of protection against Dutch attacks on their colonies fostered an insurrection. They proclaimed the Duke of Braganza as king. John IV. With diplomatic and military support from France and England, Portugal resisted Spanish offensives until the crown formally recognized its independence in the Treaty of Lisbon, 1668.
Point 17. Explain the voyages of Christopher
The
Columbus.
project of Christopher Columbus, which consisted of reaching the East Indies by sailing westward across the Atlantic, was backed by Queen Isabella following the signing of the Capitulations of Santa Fe, 1492, where he was granted the titles of Admiral, Viceroy, and a tenth of the riches found. First voyage, 1492, commanding 3 ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña. The expedition set sail from Palos de la Frontera, Huelva, and sighted land on October 12, 1492. They landed on the island of Guanahani, baptized as San Salvador, in the Bahamas, and explored Cuba and Hispaniola, Haiti and Dominican Republic. Columbus returned convinced he had reached the coasts of Asia. Subsequent voyages, 1493-1504, Columbus made 3 more voyages with clearly colonizing and commercial objectives, searching for gold and spices. During the second voyage, 1493, the first settlements were founded in the Lesser Antilles in Jamaica, triggering the first conflicts between the settlers and Columbus's authoritarian management. On the third voyage, 1498, he sighted the mouth of the Orinoco River, Venezuela, stepping onto the mainland for the first time. On the fourth voyage, 1502, he explored the coasts of Central America. Columbus died in Valladolid in 1506 without knowing he had discovered a new continent. The voyages of other sailors, the so-called minor voyages, and the expedition of the Portuguese Vasco da Gama to India in 1498 definitively confirmed the existence of America.
12. Explain the features of the Spanish Golden Age and some of its most relevant figures.
The Golden Age spans the 16th and 17th centuries, coinciding with the political peak of the Spanish Empire and its subsequent decline. Culturally, it is divided into 2 major artistic stages. The Renaissance 16th century, initially influenced by Erasmism, humanists like Luis Vives. It became more orthodox following the Council of Trent. In literature, the development of lyric poetry by Garcilaso de la Vega, the mystical literature of St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila, and the birth of the picaresque novel with Lazarillo de Tormes stood out. In juridical thought, Francisco de Vitoria founded the basis of international law. In the plastic arts, architects Pedro Machuca, Palace of Charles V, and Juan de Herrera, Monasterio de El Escorial, of an austere and geometric style, stood out. While in painting, the masterpiece of Mannerism by El Greco, The Burial of the Count of Orgaz, excelled. The Baroque 17th century, it was characterized by a pessimistic and disillusioned worldview, marked by the deep social and economic crisis of the minor Habsburgs. The monarchy and the church used art as ideological propaganda. Castilian literature reached its universal peak with Miguel de Cervantes, Don Quixote, the poets Luis de Gongora, Calderonismo, and Francisco de Quevedo, Conceptismo, and the playwrights Lope de Vega and Calderón de la Barca. In architecture, a heavily loaded ornamentation with curved lines predominated. The 17th century was the golden age of Spanish painting, with masters of the Tenebrist and Realist schools such as José de Ribera, Zurbarán, and Murillo, highlighting above all Diego Velázquez, court painter to Philip IV and absolute master of perspective and light, Las Meninas.
Unit 4. Briefly explain what enlightened despotism is, a defining feature of the Bourbon monarchy in the 18th century.
Enlightened despotism was the political variant of monarchical absolutism that predominated in Europe in the 18th century. It is defined by the application of the ideas of the Enlightenment to the actions of government, but without altering the basis of absolute power or the structure of the estate-based society. Under the motto, "Everything for the people, but without the people," monarchs such as Charles III used their unlimited authority to centralize the state, cut privileges to the church and the nobility, promote useful education, and modernize the economy, agriculture, commerce, infrastructure. Their ultimate goal was to increase the wealth, happiness, and progress of their subjects, but denying them any type of sovereignty or political participation.
Explain the meaning of the expression Age of Enlightenment by Siglo de las Luces and the characteristics of the ideological and cultural movement to which it refers.
The expression Age of Enlightenment refers to the 18th century, a period marked by the birth of the Enlightenment. This ideological, cultural, and philosophical movement aimed to illuminate humanity through the lights of reason and scientific knowledge, fighting against obscurantism, religious fanaticism, ignorance, and traditions inherited from the medieval era. Its main characteristics are: reason as the sole criterion of truth. rejection of superstition and religious dogma, the search for material happiness. The ultimate goal of human beings on earth is to achieve well-being and prosperity. Faith in progress, confidence that science, useful education, and technology would lead to indefinite social advancement. Social criticism, opposition to the privileges of the estate-based society, and defense of freedom, civil equality of citizens, and individual property.
Briefly describe why the War of the Spanish Succession occurred, which countries were involved in it, and what its outcome was. Causes.
The main cause was the death without descent in 1700 of Charles II, the last king of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain. In his will, he named Philip of Anjou the future Philip V, grandson of Louis XIV of France, as heir. The perspective of a perpetual union or alliance between France and Spain broke the European balance and unleashed the conflict.
Countries involved.
The war had two dimensions. International war. The Grand Alliance of The Hague was formed, integrated by Great Britain, the United Provinces, Holland, the Austrian Empire, and Portugal, which supported the claims of the Archduke Charles of Habsburg from the Austrian line. They faced the Franco-Spanish coalition of Philip V. Civil war. In the peninsula, the Crown of Castile mostly supported Philip V, defending French centralism, while the Crown of Aragon supported Archduke Charles to protect their regional laws and liberties against absolutism.
Result.
The war concluded in the international arena with the signing of the Treaties of Utrecht and Rastatt, 1713 to 1714. Philip V was recognized as King of Spain, but in exchange, the Spanish monarchy had to renounce all its possessions in Europe, Flanders and Italy passed to Austria, and make important commercial and territorial concessions to Great Britain. Militarily in Spain, the conflict ended after the long siege and capture of Barcelona, September 11, 1714, by Bourbon troops.
Briefly explain what the Nueva Planta decrees, Decretos de Nueva Planta, consisted of.
The Nueva Planta decrees were a set of laws promulgated by Philip V during and after the War of Succession, applied in Valencia and Aragon, 1707, Majorca, 1715, and Catalonia, 1716, which abolished the regional laws, political institutions, laws, and borders of the territories of the Crown of Aragon for having supported Archduke Charles. In their place, the political administrative organization of the Crown of Castile was imposed. With these decrees, Spain went from being a confederation of pact-based kingdoms under the Habsburgs to a unified, centralized, and uniform state, where Castilian became the only language of official administration. As an exception, Navarre and the Basque Country maintained their regional laws for having been faithful to Philip V during the war.
Briefly explain the consequences of the Treaty of Utrecht.
The Treaty of Utrecht reconfigured the European geopolitical map and had profound consequences for Spain. Loss of the empire in Europe, Spain ceded its European territories. Flanders, Milan, Naples, and Sardinia passed into the hands of Austria, while Sicily was delivered to Savoy. Peninsular territorial losses, Spain was forced to cede Gibraltar and Minorca to Great Britain. End of the American commercial monopoly. Great Britain obtained the Asiento de Negros monopoly to introduce African slaves into Spanish America for 30 years. And the Navío de Permiso, right to send a 500-ton commercial ship per year to the Indies. New international balance. Spain was degraded to a second-order power, and Great Britain consolidated itself as the great master of the seas and world commerce.
Briefly explain the administrative reforms undertaken under the Bourbon dynasty throughout the 18th century.
The Bourbons executed a deep administrative reorganization oriented toward centralization and the strengthening of absolutism. Secretariats of State and the dispatch. The old council system of the Habsburgs was replaced. The Council of Castile was relegated to a consultative role by the Secretariats of State, and the dispatch precedence of the ministries, directed by secretaries appointed directly by the king, state, war, navy, justice, and the Indies, and treasury. Provincial demarcations and intendants, the viceroyalties in the peninsula were eliminated, and the territory was divided into provinces, governed militarily and judicially by a captain general and a royal audience. For economic and fiscal management, the figure of the intendant was created, a functionary of royal designation in charge of collecting taxes and revitalizing the provincial economy. Single Cortes. The Cortes of the kingdoms of Aragon were dissolved, unifying all of them into a single Cortes of Spain that barely had real functions, limiting themselves to swearing allegiance to the heir to the crown.
Briefly explain the reformist program carried out by Charles III, Carlos III.
Charles III, 1759-1788, was the maximum exponent of enlightened despotism in Spain. His program sought to modernize the country through deep structural reforms, surrounding himself with enlightened ministers such as Floridablanca, Campomanes, the Count of Aranda, and Jovellanos. Political and social. After the Escalache riots, 1766, the king pushed for the control of public order and the urban sanitation of Madrid. Education was reformed, the economic societies of Friends of the Country were created, and the honesty of all professions was decreed, 1783, to break noble prejudices against manual labor. Religious regalism. He defended the authority of the crown over the church and decreed the expulsion of the Jesuits, 1767, due to their enormous educational influence and loyalty to the Pope. Economic. Liberalization of the price of grain, repopulation of uninhabited areas, new settlements of Sierra Morena with Pablo de Olavide, and boost to the royal manufactures.
Briefly explain the economic reforms carried out by the Spanish enlightened monarchs of the 18th century.
The Bourbons applied measures to revitalize the three main economic sectors. Agriculture. This was the main problem due to the regime of lands tied up in dead hands. Reports were written to reform it, such as the report on the agrarian law by Jovellanos. The reduction of privileges of the Mesta was pushed, the price of cereals was liberalized, and hydraulic infrastructures were created. Imperial Canal of Aragon. Industry and craftsmanship. The monopolistic control of the guilds was limited to facilitate free manufacturing. The crown financed the royal factories, luxury goods such as tapestries, glass and porcelain, or weapons, to substitute foreign imports. Commerce. In the domestic market, internal customs between kingdoms were suppressed. For foreign trade, the regulation of free trade, 1778, was decreed, which broke the monopoly of Cadiz and Seville, allowing multiple Spanish ports to trade directly with America.
Briefly explain the meaning of the family pacts.
The family pacts were three military alliance treaties signed throughout the 18th century between the crowns of Spain and France. They received this name because the Bourbon dynasty reigned in both countries. Their main objective was to join forces to counteract the maritime and imperial hegemony of Great Britain, the common enemy of both states. First, 1733, and second, Usamusfuri Pact, signed by Philip V. They involved Spain in European wars, succession of Poland and of Austria, managing to recover influence in Italy and place the future Charles III on the throne of Naples and Sicily. Third Pact, 1761, signed by Charles III. It implied Spanish participation in the 7 Years' War with a negative outcome, and subsequently in the United States War of Independence, thanks to which Spain managed to recover Minorca and Florida.
Unit 5, Document 1. Napoleon addresses the Spaniards, Bayonne, May 25, 1808.
Main idea: the official justification for Napoleon Bonaparte's intervention in Spain, presenting himself to the Spanish people not as an invader or conqueror, but as a providential savior, with a reformist and regenerative mission destined to remedy the nation's deep structural crisis. Secondary ideas: the expression of the legal legitimacy of the occupation through the direct allusion to the abdications of Bayonne, reminding the Spaniards that their own legitimate princes, Charles IV and Ferdinand VII, have voluntarily yielded all their dynastic rights to the French crown. The explicit renunciation of the direct territorial annexation of the Spanish provinces to the French Empire, clarifying that his true purpose is to establish a new framework of prosperity to win the historical gratitude of the Spanish people. The frontal critique of the previous Bourbon regime, exempting the common people from the country's historical decadence, and placing exclusive responsibility on the bad governance and corruption of preceding monarchs.
Document 2. Fragment of the Constitution of 1812.
Main idea: the legal and political dismantling of the structures of the Ancien Regime in Spain through the proclamation of the first liberal-style constitutional system, characterized by the replacement of divine right absolutism with a regulatory order based on citizen rights. Secondary ideas: the formulation of the revolutionary principle of national sovereignty, Art. 3, decisively determining that power resides essentially in the nation as a whole, and stripping the monarch of exclusive control over the drafting of fundamental laws. The definition of the state's duty as a guarantor of freedoms, Art. Point 4, legally obliging the nation to oversee and protect inalienable individual rights, such as private property and civil liberty, through universal laws. The establishment of the state model as a moderate and hereditary monarchy, art. Point 1 port, supported by a rigid separation of powers collectively conferring legislative authority to the Cortes, together with the king. Art. 15. The recognition and safeguarding of basic individual civil liberties, highlighting the suppression of arbitrary detentions through criminal procedural guarantees that foreshadow habeas corpus, art. 287, and the abolition of prior censorship through the proclamation of freedom of the press and publication for political ideas, art. 371.
Document 3. Statistical Table of the Members of the Cortes of Cadiz.
Main idea. The quantitative reflection of the sociological and ideological prominence of the bourgeoisie and urban enlightened middle classes within the Constituent Assembly of Cadiz, which allowed liberal ideas to triumph over absolutist ones despite being an intellectual minority movement. Secondary ideas. The predominant weight of the ecclesiastical estate, 90 deputies, which constituted the largest individual group in the chamber, proving that the clergy was not a homogeneous bloc, and that broad sectors of the lower clergy actively participated in the reform process. The strong representation of the professional sectors of civil service and law, 56 lawyers and 49 civil servants, legal technicians trained within the state apparatus, who provided the necessary theoretical foundation to draft and implement the new liberal legislation. The presence of military and naval officers, 39 deputies in total, a direct reflection of the wartime context of the War of Independence, which made it necessary to coordinate military actions with the political reorganization of the state. The distinctively minor presence of the traditional high aristocracy, only 14 nobles, and sectors strictly linked to the productive economy of the commercial bourgeoisie, 8 merchants, as well as the total absence of the agrarian or artisanal working classes, peasants and day laborers, confirming that the Cortes of Cadiz operated detached from the majority sociological reality of Spain at the time.
Document 4. Historical Painting, The Surrender of Bailen, by Casado del Aliso.
Main idea. The pictorial and institutional representation of the historic Spanish military victory over the French imperial troops at the Battle of Bailen, July 1808, signifying the loss of Napoleon Bonaparte's army's status as invincible in open field combat in Europe. Secondary ideas. The formal recognition of the honor and protocol of traditional warfare staged in the civilized meeting between Spanish General Francisco Javier Castaños and the defeated French General Pierre Dupont de l'Etang at the moment of the surrender of arms and capitulation of General Dupont's troops. The visual contrast between the order and discipline of both opposing regular armies, reflecting that during this first phase of the war, resistance against the French was still settled through conventional battles organized by a regular Spanish army before the massive outbreak of guerrilla warfare. The symbolic value of the triumph for the morale of the Spanish patriotic resistance, whose military impact forced the immediate retreat of the intruder King Joseph I Bonaparte from Madrid and the strategic withdrawal of the entire French military contingent north of the Ebro River.
Document 5. First Decree of the Cortes assembled in the Isla de Leon, Cadiz.
Main idea. The proclamation of the legal and political legitimacy of the General and Extraordinary Cortes as representatives of the nation, directly assuming a revolutionary principle of national sovereignty. Secondary ideas. The explicit recognition and oath of loyalty to Ferdinand VII of Bourbon as the sole and legitimate king of the Spanish nation, the declaration of absolute nullity and legal invalidity of the abdications of Bayonne in favor of Napoleon Bonaparte, arguing that these acts were executed through violence and lacked the consent of the people. The doctrinal establishment of the separation of powers, determining that it is inappropriate for state functions to be concentrated in a single organ, and reserving legislative power in its entirety for the Cortes.
Document 6. Murat informs Napoleon of the events of May 2nd.
Main idea. The official report issued by General Joachim Murat to Napoleon Bonaparte detailing the military and repressive actions deployed to quell and subdue the popular uprising of May 2nd in Madrid. Secondary ideas. The description of the moments leading up to the insurrection, characterized by the disruption of public peace due to the arrival of peasants and the spread of subversive propaganda. The account of the trigger of the conflict consisting of the crowd gathering outside the gates of the royal palace, the castle, to prevent the departure of the royal family, which prompted the imperial guard to intervene with musket fire. The narrative of the French tactical military deployment over the main centers of the insurgency, Alcalá Street, Puerta del Sol, and Plaza Mayor, using cavalry units and artillery volleys. The criminalization of civil resistance and the peasantry, concluding with the order to immediately disarm the entire population of the city.
Document 7. Oath of the Constituent Cortes in the main parish church of the Real Isla de León.
Main idea: the pictorial representation of the institutional and religious act of the oath and formal inauguration of the Constituent Cortes on September 24, 1810, symbolizing the legal birth of Spanish liberalism. Secondary ideas: the staging of the solemn commitment of the deputies to defend the integrity of the nation, the rights of Ferdinand VII, and the Catholic religion in an ecclesiastical setting. The depiction of the heterogeneity and coexistence of the different estates within the assembly, clergy, military, and bourgeois civilians, gathered in a single chamber without traditional separation. The propagandistic and historical value of the work to legitimize the constitutional process developed in Cadiz before public opinion in the face of the French occupation.
Document 8. Articles of the Constitution of 1812.
Main idea: the legal definition of the new liberal state model and the political structure of the Kingdom of Spain through the fundamental articles of the Constitution of 1812. Secondary ideas: the redefinition of the Spanish nation, art. Point 1 and 2, as the collection of all Spaniards from both hemispheres, declaring it free and independent, and decoupling it from being the patrimony of any family or person. The formal formulation of the principle of national sovereignty, art. 3, granting the nation the exclusive right to establish its fundamental laws. The establishment of the state's duty as a guarantor of civil rights, art. 4, obliging the protection of civil liberty and the property of all citizens. The adoption of a moderate hereditary monarchy as the form of government, art. Point 14, and the implementation of the separation of powers, art. 15, 16, and 17, dividing the powers of the state between the Cortes with the king, legislative, the monarch, executive, and the courts of justice, judicial.
Document 9. Declaration of the Supreme Junta of Seville, June 6, 1808.
Main idea: the official and formal declaration of war by land and sea against Emperor Napoleon I in France, legitimately issued in the name of King Ferdinand VII and the entirety of the Spanish nation. Secondary ideas: the public and international denunciation of French treachery, directly accusing Napoleon Bonaparte of having unilaterally violated the most sacred pacts previously signed with Spain. The unequivocal affirmation of the legal nullity of the dynastic abdications, arguing that the renunciation of the crown carried out by the Spanish monarchs lacks legal validity because it was imposed through the use of violence. The moral and political justification of resorting to arms before all of Europe, presenting it as the only feasible and indispensable remedy to safeguard national sovereignty given the severity of the invasion.
Document 10. La Ruga, Political and Economic Memoirs, 1787.
Main idea: the analytical and enlightened critique of the traditional Spanish aristocratic mentality, pointing out that prejudices regarding lineage and the disdain for productive activities act as direct causes of demographic stagnation and the socio-economic decline of the country. Secondary ideas: the observation of the material disparity existing within the privileged estate of the capital, where wealthy nobles coexist alongside a vast mass of hidalgos plagued by poverty. The denunciation of the institutionalized inaction and idleness of the nobility, whose members prefer to remain unproductive while waiting for a respectable public office rather than staining their family name by working in industry or manufacturing. The highlighting of the arrogance and socio-professional discrimination practiced by the privileged estates, who undervalue the essential manual professions of farmers and artisans. The description of the rigidity and lack of mobility within the social pyramid of the Ancien Régime, where nobility of blood is automatically transmitted regardless of material wealth, while the economic success of manual laborers does not allow them to rise socially unless granted a direct favor from the crown.
Document 11. Mural painting titled Constitution of 1812 in Cadiz.
Main idea: the pictorial and symbolic representation of the act of the public proclamation of the Constitution of 1812 in the city of Cadiz, staging the festive confluence between the institutions of the new liberal state and popular sovereignty. Secondary ideas: the expression of joy, patriotic fervor, and the acclamation of the urban civilian masses as the authorities pass by, showing the initial harmony of the people of Cadiz with the constitutional project. the staging of the military estate fully integrated and guarding the legal order, made visible through the uniformed officers in formation, paying honors in the square, the display of the Spanish flag and the institutional decoration of the balconies, with tapestries bearing heraldic shields, elements intended to provide solemnity, legitimacy, and traditional roots to the newly proclaimed constitutional code. The political use of the work as a piece celebrating liberal historical memory, whose purpose is to mythologize the origin of national sovereignty and the consecration of citizen rights against absolutism.
Document 12. Francisco de Goya, the 3rd of May, Prado Museum.
Main idea: the artistic depiction of the horror, drama, and rawness of the military repression exercised by French troops against the civilian population of Madrid following the revolutionary events of the previous day, elevating the anonymous martyrdom of the people to the status of a heroic symbol of patriotic resistance. Secondary ideas: the explicit denunciation of the dehumanization of war and the blind violence of empires, staged through the French firing squad, whose soldiers appear from behind, perfectly aligned, identical, and faceless, functioning as an automated, rigid, and relentless killing machine. The sacralization and absolute prominence of the unarmed civilian victims, personified in the central figure in the white shirt who adopts a gesture of open arms, evoking crucifixion, projecting innocence, defenselessness, and a defiant dignity before a fatal destiny. The representation of the diversity of collective psychological reactions to the imminence of violent death, visible in the figures of the captives waiting for their turn on their knees, covering their faces in despair, praying, or clenching their fists in anger. The visualization of bloody realism and the direct impact of firearms, captured in the corpses piled on the ground in pools of blood, eliminating any hint of classical heroic idealization or neoclassical aesthetics of death. The expressive use of space and artificial light, the large central lantern, to structure the moral focus of the composition, contrasting the luminosity that bathes the condemned against the dark, nighttime background where the silhouette of the church and the barracks of Madrid emerge, suggesting the institutional and civil abandonment of the victims.
Unit 6. Document 1. Fragment of the Constitution of 1845.
Main idea: the central idea of the text is the establishment of the legal and institutional framework of moderate doctrinarism in Spain under the reign of Isabella II. The document reflects the principle of shared sovereignty between the Crown and the Parliament, in union and in agreement with the Cortes, which represents a clear break from the progressive principle of national sovereignty. This Magna Carta seeks to consolidate an oligarchic, centralist, and restrictive state model, which notably reinforces the prerogatives of the monarchy over the legislative power. Secondary ideas: continuity of basic civil rights. It is established that Articles 2 to 9, relating to individual rights, freedom of the press, or legal security, are identical to those of the Progressive Constitution of 1837. However, in moderate practice, these rights would be severely limited by subsequent organic laws. Confessional state and support of the Church. Article 11 formally declares that the official and only religion of the nation is the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman religion. As a counterpart to ecclesiastical support and the loss of property due to confiscations, the state binds itself legally and financially to maintain the worship and its ministers. Restriction of the Senate to royal and elitist control. Articles 14 and 15 configure a Senate of a fully oligarchic nature. The number of senators becomes unlimited, and their appointment depends exclusively on the discretion of the Crown. In addition, strict selection criteria are imposed based on belonging to the high spheres of the civil, military, and ecclesiastical estates, inexorably conditioned on possessing a very high minimum income, 30,000 reals. Strengthening of the executive power of the Crown. Article 45 ratifies the enormous political weight of the Queen by granting her the exclusive prerogative to freely appoint and remove government ministers, which made her the true arbiter of the political life of the country.
Document 2. Portrait of General Ramon Maria Narvaez.
Main idea. The main idea of this image is the personification of the moderate regime and the prominence of the military estate, the espadon, in the consolidation of the 19th century liberal state. General Narvaez, the undisputed leader of the moderate party and architect of the stability of the moderate decade, is portrayed as the guardian of public order and of institutions against progressive or Carlist insurrections. Secondary ideas. Militarism in civil politics. The military uniform, the medals, and the crossed sash displayed by Narvaez visually reflect how the high commands of the army left the barracks to become the true directors of political parties and presidents of the Council of Ministers during the reign of Isabella II. The symbology of order and authority. The firm posture of the general, leaning his hand on his saber, transmits an explicit message of authority, centralization, and iron control of public order, fundamental pillars of the moderate ideology that he himself represented.
Document 3. The Manzanares Manifesto, July 6, 1854.
Main idea. The central idea of this text is the proclamation of a program of liberal regeneration and political reform drafted by Antonio Cánovas del Castillo and signed by General Leopoldo O'Donnell. The manifesto seeks to channel the discontent of the rebel military forces in the Vicalvarada and that of the popular masses, with the goal of forcing a political shift that would put an end to the oligarchic authoritarianism of the final stage of the moderate decade, giving rise to the progressive biennium. Secondary ideas. Loyalty to the monarchy, but rejection of courtly corruption. The text explicitly states that the goal is not to overthrow Isabella, we want the preservation of the throne, but to eliminate the influence of the corrupt and fundamentalist camarilla that surrounds and instrumentalizes the queen. Demand for legal and democratic reforms. The rigorous application and improvement of fundamental laws are demanded, emphasizing the need for a new electoral law, broader and less restricted by wealth, and a new printing law that guarantees true freedom of expression. Economic and labor demands. A substantial reduction in taxes is requested based on strict budget economy, as well as absolute respect for seniority and merit in civil and military employment, putting an end to the endemic favoritism of modernism. Municipal decentralization and citizen defense. The manifesto advocates for wrenching the towns from the centralization that devours them, granting them local autonomy, and demands the restitution of the national militia, the armed civil institution par excellence of progressivism, conceived as the ultimate popular guarantee to safeguard constitutional freedoms.
Document 4. Painting of the Swearing of the Constitution of 1837.
Main idea. The central idea of the work is the institutionalization and legitimation of the liberal state in Spain through the solemn act of the constitutional oath by the Regent Maria Cristina of Bourbon. This image immortalizes the moment of consensus and the legal transition toward a transactional liberalism between progressivism and modernism embodied in the Constitution of 1837, which sought to unite all liberal factions in the middle of the First Carlist War. Secondary ideas. The staging of constitutional power. The composition places the crown at the center, under a majestic canopy, but surrounded by and integrated within the parliament. This visually symbolizes that the monarchy is no longer of absolute divine right, but that its legitimacy emanates from and submits to the constitutional framework established by the parliament. The representation of the liberal elites. The massive presence of deputies, military men, ecclesiastics, and members of high civil society in the galleries exemplifies the social base that supported the new liberal regime, showing a sharp contrast with the absolutism of the past.
Document 5. Resignation of the Regent Maria Cristina, October 12, 1840.
Main idea. The fundamental idea of the document is the political capitulation and formal abdication of the Queen Governess Maria Cristina of Bourbon from the regency of the kingdom, due to her ideological incompatibility with the progressive revolutionary movement of 1840. Seeing herself unable to accept the reforms demanded by the revolutionary juntas and by General Baldomero Espartero, the regent opts for exile, which clears the way for the progressive military establishment to assume control of the state. Secondary ideas. Personal and institutional justification. Maria Cristina bases her resignation both on health reasons and on the conviction that her departure is the only viable mechanism to pacify the country, to calm minds and end the current situation, presenting herself as a sacrifice for the interest of the nation. Appeal to parliamentary legitimacy. The regent explicitly recognizes the sovereignty of the parliament, Cortes, by returning to them the mandate conferred in 1836. It was conferred upon me by the constituent Cortas and entrusts them with the constitutional task of appointing the new guardians or regents of the kingdom. Concern for the minority of age of Isabella II. In the final lines, the Queen Mother records her deep concern for the destiny of her daughters, the future Isabella II, and the Infanta Luisa Fernanda, entrusting their legal and personal custody to the Parliament and to the government ministers, according to the dictate of the current constitutional spirit.
Document 6. Map of the Carlist Wars.
Main idea. The central idea of this cartographic document is the spatial representation of the First Carlist War, 1833–1840, showing the territorial division of Spain, the areas of entrenchment of the traditionalist faction, and the military mobilization of its troops through the great expeditions across the peninsular geography. The map provides evidence that the conflict was not just a regional dynastic clash, but a true civil war with impact and incursions at a national level. Secondary ideas. Geography of Carlist entrenchment. The areas of strong implementation of Carlism are visually delimited, concentrated in the northern peninsula, Basque Country, Navarre, and the interior of Catalonia, highlighting Berga, as well as in the Maestrazgo, Morella, and Cantavieja, characterized by the defense of traditional regional charters, fueros, and absolutism. The expedition of General Miguel Gomez, 1836, the extensive itinerary of this Carlist military incursion is traced, which, starting from the north, traversed a large part of Asturias, Galicia, Leon, Castile, Extremadura, and Andalusia, demonstrating the Carlist capability to harass the liberal rear guard, although without managing to permanently consolidate those territories. The Royal Expedition of Don Carlos, 1837, the strategic advance of the pretender to the throne himself, Carlos Maria Isidro de Bourbon, is represented, who led a large military column from the Basque Navarrese territory toward Catalonia, the Maestrazgo, and the surroundings of Madrid, with the failed objective of forcing the capitulation of the liberal regency.
Document 7. Fragment of the Constitution of 1845.
Main idea. The main idea of this legal text is the establishment of the principles of doctrinaire or moderate liberalism during the effective reign of Isabella II. Through these articles, a clear break is made from the progressive notion of national sovereignty, and a shared sovereignty between the Crown and the Parliament is implemented, strengthening the power of the monarchy and restricting representation in favor of the landowning and financial elites of the country. Secondary ideas. Formal maintenance of civil rights. The document states that Articles 2 to 9 are formally identical to those of the Progressive Constitution of 1837, maintaining basic civil liberties on paper, although in moderate practice their exercise would be subject to very restrictive organic laws. Catholic confessional state. Article 11 sanctions that the Catholic religion is the only one of the Spanish nation, formally obliging the state to the financial support of worship and the clergy, which meant a reconciliation with the Church after the confiscations. Elitization and royal control of the Senate. Articles 14 and 15 institute an upper chamber of an oligarchic character, eliminating seat limits and granting its free appointment to the king. The position is restricted to the high ecclesiastical, military, and aristocratic hierarchies, also requiring a very high personal fortune, 30,000 reales of income. Expansion of the royal prerogative. Article 45 underlines the preeminent political role granted to the Crown by allowing it to appoint and depose government ministers completely freely, turning the monarch into the true motor of the executive power.
Document 8. Engraving of the Embrace of Vergara of 1839.
Main idea. The central idea of this iconographic document is the staging of the end of the First Carlist War on the northern front through the peaceful agreement sealed between the liberal general Baldomero Espartero and the Carlist general Rafael Maroto in 1839. The engraving exalts the value of reconciliation, the cessation of fratricidal hostilities, and the assimilation of the defeated side within the new Isabelline institutional order. Secondary ideas. The military and political transaction. The physical embrace between both leaders on horseback, located in the central axis of the image, symbolizes the mutual pact. This agreement entailed the preservation of the military employments and ranks of the Carlist officers who swore loyalty to Isabella II, as well as the promise to maintain or modify the northern regional charters. The fraternization of the troops. In the margins of the engraving, the soldiers of both armies are seen formed up and watching the scene, which reflects the relief of the fighting forces and the search for popular validation for a pact that put an end to 6 years of bloody conflict.
Document 9. The Manzanares Manifesto, July 6, 1854.
Main idea. The main idea of the manifesto is the presentation of the reformist program of the liberal uprising that put an end to the moderate decade and inaugurated the progressive biennium. Drafted by Canovas del Castillo and proclaimed by O'Donnell, the text seeks the backing of the middle and urban working classes through the promise of a profound institutional regeneration to end the corruption and authoritarianism of the recent moderate governments. Secondary ideas. Preservation of the monarchy against cliques. The text clarifies that the rebels defend the continuity of the throne of Isabella II, but demand the eradication of the ultra-conservative courtly clique camarilla that manipulates and dishonors the crown. Expansion of freedoms and political rights. The strict fulfillment and open reform of the essential laws of the state are demanded, focusing explicitly on improving the electoral law to expand suffrage, and the printing law to eliminate obstacles to freedom of expression. Socioeconomic demands and military merit. A generalized reduction of taxes through a policy of austerity and fiscal savings is advocated, while also demanding an end to cronyism by protecting merit and seniority within civil and military ranks. Anti-centralism and citizen sovereignty. The signatories reject the administrative centralization that devours the provinces, claiming municipal autonomy, and impose the restitution of the national militia as an armed safeguard for the people, subjecting the bases of the final reform to a future constituent parliament.
Document 10. Portraits of Generals Espartero and Narvaez.
Main idea. The core idea of this double pictorial composition is the representation of the phenomenon of espadonismo, rule of the big swords, meaning the monopoly of 19th century political leadership by top military commanders. Generals Baldomero Espartero, icon of the Progressive Party, and Ramon Maria Narvaez, leader of the Moderate Party, personify the violent alternation in power through military uprisings, pronunciamientos, and the deep embedding of the military element in the consolidation of the liberal state. Secondary ideas. Espartero as progressive charisma. The portrait on the left displays the general wearing presidential and noble insignia, evoking his role as regent of the kingdom and leader of popular reforms, whose legitimacy was born from his victories in the Carlist Wars. Narvaez as moderate order. The canvas on the right shows the Andalusian general with a stern gesture and gala attire, symbolizing the construction of the centralized state, the fierce defense of property, and the strict maintenance of public order against any hint of popular revolution.
Document 11. Fragment of the Constitution of 1837.
Main idea. The central idea of this text is the expression of the transactional liberal ideology of 1837, born with the purpose of overcoming the rigidity of the Constitution of 1812 and unifying the liberal currents, progressives and moderates, in the face of the Carlist threat. Although it stems from a progressive summons that proclaims national sovereignty, it introduces moderate elements, such as bicameralism, to provide stability to the institutions. Secondary ideas. Consolidation of individual rights and freedoms. Articles 2 to 10 shield advanced civil liberties. Prior press censorship is abolished by establishing trials by jury. Legal codes are unified under a single jurisdiction. The end of class privileges. The civil service is opened up to personal merit, and the inviolability of the home and private property are guaranteed. Compromise formula on religious matters. Article 11 avoids declaring Catholicism as the exclusive state religion, but adopts a pragmatic commitment. The state takes on the obligation to finance and economically maintain the worship and ministers of the Catholic Church. Separation of powers and bicameral structure. Legislative power is shared between the Parliament and the King, and the Parliament is divided into two houses equal in powers. The Senate, with access limited by age and income regulated by law, and the Congress of Deputies. Delimitation of the power of the Crown. Articles 45, 46, and 50 recognize the legitimacy of Isabella II and grant her the executive power to enforce the laws, maintain public order, and sanction or promulgate state regulations.
Unit 7. Document 1. Circular of the Ministry of the Interior, Francisco P. Y. Margall.
Main idea. The legitimate proclamation of the First Spanish Republic by the Cortes, following the abdication of Amadeo I of Savoy, and the political directive to consolidate and bring prestige to the new regime by guaranteeing public order. Secondary ideas. The justification of the Republic as a peaceful regime that has been established without bloodshed or social unrest. The desire to practically refute those detractors who systematically and inevitably associated the Republican model with chaos and anarchy. The definition of the fundamental principles of the new system under the institutional motto of order, liberty, and justice. the legal imperative to scrupulously respect existing citizen rights, specifying the absolute freedom of conscience and thought already included in Title I of the Constitution of 1869.
Document 2. Speech by Emilio Castelar before Congress, February 11, 1873.
Main idea. The Republic does not arrive in Spain by means of an insurrection or the direct triumph of the Republican Party, but rather as an inevitable outcome imposed by historical circumstances and the definitive collapse of the monarchical institution in the country. Secondary ideas. The exoneration of political blame or responsibility from the different factions of the Cortes for the fall of the regime, affirming that no civil or military group has deliberately killed the monarchy. The enumeration of the process of decomposition of the different monarchical models in 19th century Spain, the death of the traditional monarchy with Ferdinand VII, the end of the parliamentary monarchy with the exile of Isabella II, and the failure of the democratic path following the resignation of Amadeo of Savoy. The characterization of the advent of the Republic as a natural and historically inevitable event, a conspiracy of society, of nature, of history, the lyrical call to the Cortes to accept and greet the birth of the new political regime with optimism, comparing it to a sun rising by its own strength.
Document 3. Image-Amadeo I before the corpse of Prim. Work by Antonio Gisbert, 1870.
Main idea. The pictorial representation of the profound loneliness, institutional weakness, and political abandonment with which King Amadeo I of Savoy begins his brief reign in Spain, staged through official mourning following the assassination of his main backer and political protector, General Juan Prim. Secondary ideas. The tragic political setback that the assassination of Prim meant for the stability of the new constitutional monarchy, as the only leader capable of keeping the monarchical democratic coalition unified, disappeared. The visible rigidity and distance between the civil and military authorities present at the mourning, which anticipates the lack of real support, institutional isolation, and widespread rejection that the monarch would suffer from the country's traditional elites.
Document 4. Proclamation of Prim Spain with Honor, September 19, 1868.
Main idea. The formal announcement of the military and civil uprising initiated in Cadiz to depose Queen Isabella II, with the unrenounceable objective of returning national sovereignty to the Spanish people and restoring the institutional dignity of the country. Secondary ideas. The explicit denunciation of the corruption of the Elizabethan regime, accusing it of constantly violating the fundamental law, the Constitution, and of tampering with electoral processes through bribery and threats. The collective demand to live under a framework of freedom and public honesty after years of continuous political abuses and scandals. The organizational proposal to establish a provisional government that brings together all the vital forces of the country in an orderly manner. The establishment of universal suffrage as the indispensable democratic tool to lay the foundations for the political and social regeneration of the nation.
Document 5. Image-Did General Pafia dissolves the Cortes in 1874.
Main idea. The visual portrayal of the end of the federal and institutional republic through the coup d'état of General Pafia on January 3, 1874, represented by the armed intrusion of law enforcement forces into the Congress of Deputies to dissolve the Cortes. Secondary ideas. The situation of disorder, confusion, and agitation among the deputies who abandoned their seats faced with the intervention of military forces and the civil guard. The radical violation of the constitutional and parliamentary order as the only swift method employed by conservative sectors to prevent political power from returning to the hands of the federal Republican factions.
Document 6. Manifesto of the Revolutionary Junta of Seville, September 20, 1868.
Main idea. The public declaration of the fundamental political, democratic, and economic principles adopted by the junta after the triumph of the 1868 revolution to carry out the regeneration of the country and put an end to the Bourbon dynasty. Secondary ideas. The consecration of free and universal suffrage as the sole legitimate source of national sovereignty and expression of the people's will, the establishment of absolute democratic freedoms, highlighting freedom of the press, without prior censorship or financial bonds, freedom of education, and freedom of worship. The proposal of economic reforms oriented toward freedom of trade and industry, suggesting a tariff review with a view to the future implementation of free trade. The demand to call Constituent Cortes do direct universal suffrage in order to draft a new constitution in line with the needs of the time.
Document 7. Caricature-R20.
Main idea. The satirical and international criticism of the difficult and desperate search for a foreign monarch by the Spanish government, staged as an employment office or placement agency offering the vacant throne after the exile of Isabella II. Secondary ideas: the ridiculing of the Spanish crown, shown as merchandise for rent, subject to contractual conditions and exposed to the scrutiny of different candidates or European powers. The personification of General Juan Prim as the main promoter or agent in charge of managing the royal selection process at the expense and on behalf of the nation.
Document 8. Caricature. Prim blindly searches for a regime.
Main idea: the political satire on the disorientation, indecision, and lack of consensus among the different factions of the democratic sexenio, represented in a popular game played blindly, Blind Man's Buff, led by General Prim to define the definitive form of government for the state. Secondary ideas: the representation of the allegory of liberty, or the republic, as the goal that the distinct political and ideological leaders of the era try to reach, capture, or evade. The visualization of the tensions and institutional chaos caused by the inability of the parties of the revolutionary coalition to consolidate a common and stable political path for the country.
Unit 8. Document 1. Benito Pérez Galdós, Spanish Politics, 1884.
Main idea: the manipulation and absolute control of elections by the government. The political party that takes over the Ministry of the Interior is guaranteed electoral victory in advance and obtains a parliament, chambers, entirely to its liking and measure. Secondary ideas: systemic electoral fraud. The use of corrupt methods to alter results is described, such as coercion, violence, and outrages, and the falsification of votes using the identity of deceased individuals, resurrections of the dead, the detachment and absenteeism of the population. The vast majority of citizens do not participate in elections due to disdain and skepticism, convinced that the representative system is flawed and will not solve their problems. Political clientelism. Voting is reduced solely to those minority sectors seeking to obtain favors, perks, or personal benefits through their political connections.
Document 2. Electoral Results, 1881 to 1898.
Main idea: the agreed alternation in power, peaceful turn. The data demonstrates mathematically how the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party took turns in government in a systematic and artificial manner. Secondary ideas: prefabricated absolute majorities. Every time elections were called, the party whose turn it was to govern obtained a crushing victory. For example, the Liberals achieved 297 seats in 1881, the Conservatives 318 in 1884, and so on, which proves that the results were decided before the voting. In existence of a real opposition, the outgoing party moved into a controlled minority position, guaranteeing the stability of the regime and the exclusion of other political forces, Republicans, Carlists, Socialists.
Document 3. Bounty Almoral, Spain as it is, 1886.
Main idea: the electoral farce directed from the central power. The Spanish electoral process is an absolute lie, where the true and sole elector is the Minister of the Interior, who designs and executes the results from his office in Madrid. Secondary ideas: the complicity of institutions and civil servants. To carry out the fraud, the minister counts on the active collaboration of civil governors, judges, university dignitaries, and the entire civil service apparatus of the state. Specific mechanisms of vote adulteration, the encasillado and the pucherazo. It details how electoral rolls were manipulated by including imaginary names or those of deceased persons whose identities were impersonated at the ballot boxes by subordinate public employees disguised in civilian clothes, a fact that the author himself exemplifies with the personal experience of the vote of his deceased father.
Document 4.
Main idea: the public legitimization of the new monarch. The engraving illustrates the triumphant entry of Alfonso XII into Madrid on January 15, 1875, staging the popular institutional and military support for the re-establishment of the Bourbon dynasty on the throne after the turbulent years of the democratic sexennial. Secondary ideas: the prominence of the military establishment. A strong presence of troops on horseback and on foot escorting the king is observed, which underlines the decisive role of the army, especially Martínez Campos's uprising in Sagunto, in the success of the monarchical return. Enthusiasm and social pacification. The streets adorned with flags and the crowd gathered on balconies and sidewalks are intended to convey an atmosphere of normalcy, order, and collective hope in contrast to the previous instability.
Document 5, Sandhurst Manifesto 1874.
Main idea: the proposal of a constitutional monarchy as the definitive solution. Alfonso de Bourbon positions himself as the sole legitimate depositary of the Spanish dynastic right, following the abdication of Isabella II, and offers the monarchical restoration as the only way to guarantee peace, unity, and legal order against the nation's crises. Secondary ideas: ideological definition of the future king. The monarch defines himself as a man of the century, truly liberal, as well as a good Catholic, seeking to reconcile religious tradition with the principles of modern liberal constitutionalism. An inclusive project without exclusions, it is emphasized that the new regime will welcome all compatriots of good faith, regardless of their political background, presenting himself as a dispassionate and neutral figure capable of overcoming partisan divisions.
Document 6.
Main idea: the numerical expression of two-party turnismo. The table of seats visualizes the regular and artificial alternation between the conservative and liberal blocs between 1876 and 1886, the central axis devised by Canovas to give stability to the regime. Secondary ideas: predetermined absolute majorities. The party that calls the elections systematically obtains an overwhelming victory. The conservatives in 1876 and 1879 with 333 and 293 seats. The liberals in 1881 with 297, etc., demonstrating that the popular vote did not decide the government. Marginality of alternative forces, groups such as the Republicans or third options, others, are reduced to token numbers reflecting the effectiveness of fraud in excluding forces outside the dynastic pact from Parliament.
Document 7. Emilio Castelar, Parliamentary Speeches, 1881.
Main idea: the recognition of the consolidation of democratic freedoms under the liberal government. The Republican leader Emilio Castelar values positively Sagasta's arrival to power, highlighting that his government has managed to provide the country with practical freedoms that place Spain on par with the most advanced nations in the world. Secondary ideas: the merits of the previous conservative period. It is recognized that the previous cabinet of Cánovas del Castillo rendered the crucial service of stabilizing the state and putting an end to armed conflicts, the Carlist Civil War, and the pacification of Cuba. Specific open-door measures of Sagasta, the reforms of the liberal government, are praised, such as the removal of restrictions on the press law, the opening of the university to ideological plurality, and the granting of the broad right to assembly. The compatibility of freedom with order, the commitment of the new political period to strictly maintain public peace and order in the streets simultaneously with the exercise of civil rights, is affirmed.
Document 8. Benito Pérez Galdós, Spanish Politics, 1884.
Main idea: the entirely fraudulent nature of the electoral system. Galdós denounces that parliamentary elections are an absolute farce directed vertically by the Ministry of the Interior, meaning that no true national sovereignty or real political competition exists. Secondary ideas: mechanisms of suffrage adulteration, very low voter turnout, coercion, violence and outrages, and blatant tricks such as the voting of deceased individuals or resurrections of the dead are confirmed. The apathy and disillusionment of society. The vast majority of citizens adopt a stance of contemptuous absenteeism, aware that the representative mechanisms are rigged and do not serve to address their real demands. The artificial manufacturing of minorities, the opposition. Fraud not only serves to grant victory to the government, but the Minister of the Interior himself designs the opposition's seats to his measure to feign a legitimate parliamentary functioning.
Unit 9, Document 1. Statistical Table of Casualties in Cuba and the Philippines, 1895-1898.
Nature and classification. This is a primary source of a historical statistical nature and demographic military content. The data is public and was compiled subsequently by the historian Melchor Fernández Almagro in his work Political History of Contemporary Spain. Analysis and development. The document breaks down in a meticulous manner the human losses suffered by the Spanish army during the last colonial conflict, 1895-1898. It divides the deceased by their rank, generals, officers, and soldiers, and fundamentally by the cause of their death. Explanation of content. The historical relevance of this table lies in the overwhelming disproportion between casualties caused by enemy fire and those caused by sanitary factors. Out of a total of more than 55,000 deceased soldiers, barely 1,314 died directly in combat and 704 from subsequent wounds. In contrast, the sum of deaths from yellow fever, 13,000, and, above all, from other infectious diseases, 40,000, represents nearly 95% of the total mortality of the troops. Historical significance. This data demonstrates the terrible hygienic conditions, the lack of medicines, such as quinine, and the absolute lack of logistical and supply preparation with which the Restoration regime sent peninsular conscripts to fight in an adverse tropical climate. It also indirectly evidences the impact of the strategy of concentration of peasants, which spread epidemics that ended up infecting the Spanish army itself en masse.
Document 2. Fragment of the Peace Treaty of Paris, December 10, 1898.
Nature and classification. It is a primary source of an unquestionable legal, diplomatic, and political nature. It is a public document of international relevance signed by representatives of the Spanish Crown and the United States government following the defeat of the Spanish fleets. Analysis and development. This legal text formally certifies the end of the Spanish-American War and establishes the conditions imposed by the winning power, USA, on the defeated one, Spain. The fragment includes the first 3 articles of the agreement. Article 1. Spain is forced to unconditionally renounce sovereignty over and ownership of the island of Cuba. It specifies that the territory will temporarily become occupied by the United States, which would lead to control of the island through the subsequent Platt Amendment. Article 2. The forced cession to the USA of the island of Puerto Rico, the rest of the West Indies under Spanish control, and the strategic island of Guam in the Mariana Archipelago Pacific, is imposed. Article 3. It certifies the surrender of the archipelago of the Philippine Islands. In exchange, the United States agrees to pay Spain the sum of $20 million. Historical significance. The Treaty of Paris represents the death certificate of the Spanish Overseas Empire, which had begun in 1492. Spain loses at a single stroke its last strongholds in America and the Pacific. This permanently relegated the country to the status of a second-tier international power and plunged it into the collective trauma of the disaster of 98.
Document 3. Extract from the Journal of Sessions of the Congress of Deputies, February 23, 1899.
Nature and classification. Primary source of a political and narrative nature. It is a public document that contains a parliamentary speech delivered in the Spanish Parliament a few months after the signing of the peace. It took place in the midst of debate and mutual accusations regarding responsibilities for the colonial disaster. Analysis and development. The text exposes the passionate argument of a defender of the political and military management against harsh criticism from the opposition, directed at your lordship. The core of this speech revolves around the ethical and patriotic justification for having entered a war that was known to be materially lost against the United States. Argumentation of the text. The speaker poses a moral dilemma. Faced with the American ultimatum to abandon Cuba, Spain could not yield without offering resistance, saying goodbye to each other as one might dismiss a lackey. This was especially true given that an impressive contingent of 300,000 men, among regular soldiers, volunteers, and guerrillas, was deployed on the island. The author argues that military defeat was preferable to prior unconditional surrender. He states that although the country has been vanquished and left in an unfortunate situation, military honor has been saved. He maintains that if Spain had yielded without fighting, the army would have returned covered in disgrace, and Spain would have been erased from the number of civilized nations and turned into a despicable nation. Historical significance. This document perfectly illustrates the mentality of the political elites and the press of the era. They preferred to sacrifice thousands of lives, as seen in Document 1, in a suicidal war purely out of patriotism and to safeguard the honor of the monarchy and the army, rather than engage in a pragmatic negotiation that would have avoided the human bloodshed.
Document 4. Portrait of General Valeriano Weyler.
Nature and classification. Primary source of an iconographic nature, a political military portrait of the era. Analysis and development. The image shows General Valeriano Weyler y Nicolau in full dress uniform. He sports high military decorations and the general staff sashes, which highlights his status as the highest military authority and his weight within the structure of the Restoration Army. Historical significance. Weyler is the key figure of the penultimate stage of the Cuban War, 1896-1897. He was sent by the Prime Minister Antonio Cánovas del Castillo to replace General Martínez Campos. While Martínez Campos had attempted a strategy of pacification and political flexibility, Weyler personified the hard line and total military repression. His strategy relied on forceful methods to cut off popular support for the insurgents of José Martí and Máximo Gómez. He divided the island using trochas, fortified and guarded lines, and ordered the brutal forced concentration of the peasant population into closed villages. Connection to the disaster. Although his strategy militarily suffocated the guerrilla forces, it generated an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe due to hunger and epidemics among civilians and the soldiers themselves, the root of the figures we see in Document 1. His cruelty was utilized by the international press and U.S. President McKinley to justify U.S. humanitarian intervention. This turned Weyler into the political trigger that accelerated the international conflict. His replacement in late 1897 by a desperate liberal government came too late to stop the war.
Document 5. Peace Treaty between Spain and the United States of America, Paris, 1898.
Nature of the document. Primary source of a legal, diplomatic, and public nature, which puts an end to the state of war between the Spanish crown and the American government. Main idea: the formal capitulation of the Spanish colonial empire through the forced renunciation of sovereignty over its last overseas territories in the Caribbean and the Pacific in favor of the United States. Secondary ideas. Loss of sovereignty over Cuba. Spain abdicates all rights over the island and undertakes its immediate military evacuation. It specifies that the territory will come under the direct occupation and tutelage of the United States. Forced territorial cession. The explicit surrender to U.S. sovereignty of the island of Puerto Rico, the rest of the possessions in the West Indies, and the island of Guam in the Mariana Archipelago is stipulated. The sale of the Philippines. The transfer of control of the Philippine Islands is agreed upon in exchange for financial compensation of $20 million. The U.S. government commits to paying this within a period of 3 months following the ratification of the treaty. Temporary commercial concession. A financial safeguard clause is introduced. By this clause, for a period of 10 years, Spanish ships and goods will be allowed to enter Philippine ports under the same tariff and favorable conditions as American goods.
Document 6. Ultimatum from the United States Congress to Spain, April 18, 1898.
Nature of the document. Primary source of a political and diplomatic nature. It is a public legislative resolution that acts de facto as a conditional declaration of war. Main idea: the peremptory and unconditional demand by the American government for Spain to immediately abandon its sovereignty and withdraw all its troops from Cuba. This was under the threat of direct military intervention if it did not receive a satisfactory response within a period of 5 days. Secondary ideas. Humanitarian and moral justification. The U.S. Congress grants itself the right to intervene by claiming that the horrible conditions of the war in Cuba have offended the morals of its people for more than 3 years. This is a clear indirect allusion to General Weyler's concentration policy. The casus belli of the Maine, the destruction of the American battleship in the port of Havana, is explicitly used as the definitive trigger. It served as irrefutable proof that the situation on the island was intolerable for American security. Proclamation of Cuban independence. The U.S. formally declares that the Cuban people possess the legitimate right to be free and independent from peninsular colonial rule. Setting the deadline. Noon on Saturday, April 23, 1898 is established as the final unextendable deadline for Spain to comply with the resolution. Otherwise, full executive power is granted to President McKinley to employ the nation's entire military force.
Document 7. Engraving of the battleship Maine in Havana Bay.
Nature of the document. Primary source of an iconographic and journalistic nature, distributed by the magazine of the era La Ilustración Española y Americana. Main idea: the visual and propagandistic representation of the American warship USS Maine anchored in Cuban waters during its friendly visit in early 1898. This element became the great geopolitical catalyst for the war. Secondary ideas. Symbol of imperialist presence. The image captures the deployment of the United States military potential in the Caribbean. It was sent under the pretext of protecting American interests and citizens in a Cuba devastated by the insurrection. Evidence of the triggering element. The engraving immortalizes the vessel prior to its mysterious explosion on February 15, 1898, in the port of Havana. This event, whose actual authorship was never clarified, was immediately exploited by the American sensationalist press, the Yellow Press of Hearst and Pulitzer. They used it to inflame American patriotism and build the perfect pretext for the ultimatum contained in Document 6.
Document 8, Monte Cristi Manifesto, March 25, 1895.
Nature of the document, primary source of a political narrative and ideological nature. It is the founding text of the final phase of the Cuban War of Independence, drafted in exile. Main idea, the proclamation of the principles of the Cuban Revolution by its revolutionary leaders. They defined the armed uprising not as an attack filled with hatred against the Spanish people, but as an exclusive and legitimate struggle against the oppressive colonial system of the Restoration. Secondary ideas, war without ethnic or national hatred. José Martí and Máximo Gómez insist that Cubans bear no resentment toward the ordinary Spanish citizen. They state that the war will end by mutual agreement between both peoples once the island is free. Empathy with the conscripted soldier. The text exempts the Spanish conscripts, who make up the colonial troops, from blame. It defines them as victims of a forced army, who have been torn from their homes by the cruelty of the crown, to fight against a freedom that they themselves yearn for. Promise of an inclusive state. It ensures that the future Republic of Cuba will be a peaceful, safe, and welcoming home for all honest and hard-working Spaniards who choose to remain. They will be able to live and work on the island under conditions of full freedom. Criticism of the Spanish political regime. The manifesto concludes by noting that Spanish citizens will enjoy rights and progress in Cuba that they could never find in the short term on the Iberian Peninsula. This is due to the weakness, apathy, and political vices, alluding to bossism and structural corruption, that consume the Restoration system.
Unit 10, Document 1. Address by Mendizábal to the Queen Regent Maria Cristina, February 21, 1836.
Nature of the document. Primary source of a political, economic, and public nature. It consists of the statement of reasons that the minister Juan Alvarez Mendizábal submits to the regent to justify the imminent decree of sale of national assets. Main idea, the argument for the ideological, financial, and economic objectives of disorganization, conceived not only as a mechanism of fiscal urgency, but as an indispensable structural reform to consolidate the liberal regime and boost the wealth of the country. Secondary ideas, sanitizing the public accounts. Mendizábal points out that the sale of state assets is a priority way to mitigate the national public debt, offering the state's creditors a real guarantee of repayment tied to the proceeds of the auctions. Economic revitalization of the countryside. The text defends that the privatization of land will serve to revitalize a dead wealth, transforming the immobilized property of dead hands into fully productive market goods. Creation of a social base attached to liberalism. The minister details the purpose of giving rise to a broad mass of agricultural landowners linked to the success of the liberal side, since the defense of their new wealth against Carlism will depend on the triumph of the current institutions.
Document 2. Bar graph on ecclesiastical and civil disorganization.
Nature of the document. Secondary source of a statistical and economic nature that quantifies the value of disorganized assets in millions of reis de vellon across 4 well-defined chronological phases. Main idea, the comparative evolution and total volume of capital mobilized during the 2 great waves of desamortizaciones in the 19th century, that of Mendizábal 1836, of a markedly religious nature, and that of Meadows 1855, with a strong weight on municipal and civil properties. Secondary ideas. Initial ecclesiastical phase 1836-1844. The graph confirms the absolute dominance of the sale of properties of the clergy, which reaches its historical peak close to 3,500 million reales de vellon, compared to an almost negligible civil volume. Moderate stagnation 1845 to 1854. It shows the drastic halt of the process during the moderate decade, a period in which the economic activity of the auctions is reduced to a minimum due to the policy of reconciliation with the Catholic Church. The progressive biennium 1855-1856. It reflects the simultaneous reactivation of both branches of the process as a result of the general law of Pascual-Meadows, recording for the first time a numerical balance in the sales of civil and ecclesiastical assets. The civil turnaround of the final stretch, 1858-1867, it highlights the predominance of municipal disorganization, where civil assets experience their largest volume. close to 3,000 million reales de Vellón, completing the transfer of communal lands to the private sector.
Document 3. Real Decree of Disorganization of Juan Alvarez Mendizábal, February 19, 1836.
Nature of the document. Primary source of a legal, legislative, and public nature, drafted in the name of the child Queen Isabella II. Main idea. The immediate regulatory expression that decrees and implements the seizure and release to public auction of all real estate corresponding to the suppressed religious corporations and orders. Secondary ideas. Justification of the measure. In the preamble, explicit reference is made to the necessity and convenience of diminishing the public debt as the priority reason for the state to legislate this expropriation. Extension of the sellable mass. Article 1 decrees that all real estate that belonged to extinguished communities, as well as any other property that had passed into the hands of the nation for other previous reasons, is up for sale. Exceptions for state and heritage use. Article 2 establishes limitations to the process, safeguarding those unique properties that the government decides to preserve in order to house public services, protect artistic monuments, or exalt the historical memory of the nation.
Document 4. Cartography of the final bidding value of the estates.
Nature of the document. Secondary source of a cartographic and geographical economic type that divides by provinces the final economic return obtained from the agrarian auctions. Main idea. The spatial confirmation that the impact and collection of the disorganization process were highly heterogeneous on the peninsular map, with the largest economic transfer concentrated in the largest state centers of the south and in the capital of the state. Secondary ideas. Zones of maximum economic value. The areas colored in warm tones place provinces like Madrid, Toledo, Ciudad Real, Sevilla, or Córdoba as the epicenters of the largest financial transactions, exceeding 40, 50, and 70 million reales, linked to large agrarian extensions or high-cost urban real estate. Medium level of impact. The Castilian interior, the Mediterranean facade, Valencia, Barcelona, and a good part of the Ebro Basin record an intermediate incidence, moving within stable ranges of between 10 and 30 million reals in final bids. Areas of minimal or zero impact. The Cantabrian coast in the northern peninsula, Galicia, Asturias, Cantabria, present token values of less than 5 million, while the Basque Foral provinces and Navarre appear exempt. No desamortización occurs, demonstrating a different property structure or a self-granted institutional break.
Documents 7 and 9. General Desamortización Law of Pascual Meadows, May 19, 1855.
Nature of the document. Primary source of a legal, legislative, and public nature. It corresponds to the legal text sanctioned by Queen Isabella II and promoted by her Minister of Finance, Pascual Meadows, during the Progressive Biennium. Main idea, the establishment of a general and absolute desamortización that decrees the mandatory sale of all real estate belonging to institutions of the old regime and local corporations that remained immobilized under the status of dead hands. Secondary ideas, the text lists exhaustively the affected subjects. It is not limited to properties of the state or the secular and regular clergy, but includes military orders, confraternities, charitable institutions, public instruction, and fundamentally, the municipal and communal lands of the villages, town councils. Mechanism of public sale, art. 3. The procedure for forced disposal is dictated, forcing the state to fragment and auction all these properties through the public bidding system, auctions to the highest bidder to guarantee free competition in the market, obligation of cash payment, art. By the law imposes that the final successful bidders of the estates pay the costs strictly in cash, unlike Mendizábal's desamortización, which allowed paying with debt bonds. Motto sought to collect immediate liquidity to finance the state plan for infrastructure and modernization.
Document 8. Approval of the Real Decree of Ecclesiastical Desamortización, February 19, 1836.
Nature of the document. Primary source of a legal, legislative, and public nature. Decreed by the governing queen, Maria Cristina de Borbón, on behalf of her underage daughter, Isabella II. Main idea, the final legal sanction to immediately seize and auction the entirety of the rural and urban properties belonging to the communities of religious orders that had been extinguished by the state. Secondary ideas. Double socio-economic objective. The preamble states openly that the decree responds to the financial urgency of reducing the amount of the consolidated public debt combined with the purpose of turning those waste fields over to private national interest for their commercial and agrarian exploitation. Criticism of the immobilization of land. The text announces that maintaining these assets in their current state of disuse or dead hands causes a notable detriment and a harmful delay for the development of the wealth of the entire nation.
Document 10. General Railway Law, June 3, 1855.
Nature of the document. Primary source of a legal, economic, and public nature, promulgated by the Progressive Parliament during the reign of Isabella II. Main idea. The articulation of the basic legal framework to boost and regulate the massive construction of the Spanish railway network, seeking to attract private and international capital through a policy of strong incentives and state protection. Secondary ideas. Radial classification of the network, ARTS, Point 1 and 2. It establishes the division of railway layouts between general and private service lines. It fixes a centralist and radial model by classifying as first order those tracks that depart from Madrid bound for the coasts or outer borders of the peninsula. Public domain and control of concessions, Arts 3 and 6. It defines railways as infrastructure of public utility and domain, but reserves exploitation to the private sector through the mandatory requirement of obtaining a prior concession granted by the government. Guarantees to foreign capital, Art. 19. To capture the massive external investments needed, especially from French banking, the state places these funds under its special safeguard, decreeing that they will be exempt from confiscations, reprisals, or seizures in the event of a military conflict. Incentives and privileges to construction companies, Art. 20. Broad material benefits are granted to railway companies, including the free transfer of public domain lands occupied by the track and the exemption from local usage fees, so that their workers can freely use timber, pasture, and livestock of the municipalities through which the layout passes.
Unit 11. Document 1 published in La Vanguardia, September 13, 1923. A. Which historical event does it correspond to?
It corresponds to the military coup d'état led by the Captain General of Catalonia, Miguel Primo de Rivera, on September 13, 1923. This pronouncement had the tacit support of King Alfonso XIII and meant the end of the constitutional regime of the Bourbon Restoration, giving way to an authoritarian dictatorship.
B. Summarize its main ideas.
Moral justification of the coup. The text expresses that the military feel forced to act, despite preferring legality, to answer the clamorous demand of citizens who love their homeland. Anti-parliamentarism and regenerationism. It directly blames political professionals for a succession of misfortunes and immoralities started after the disaster of 1898 that threatened the tragic end of Spain. It states that the healthy people demand this intervention. Creation of a provisional military directorate. It announces the establishment in Madrid of a transitional military directorate that will take the reins of the state with the priority objective of maintaining public order. Strategic turn in Morocco. It declares that the army's honor does not depend on a stubborn effort in North Africa and promises to look for a prompt, dignified, and sensible solution to the bloody Moroccan colonial conflict. Punishment of traditional parties. It establishes a sanction and condemnation of total removal from public life for all political parties of the Restoration due to their collective responsibility in the country's crisis.
C. Develop the importance it had and its consequences.
Importance. This document is the founding manifesto that de facto liquidates the Constitution of 1876. It is of enormous importance because it reflects the ideology of the Iron Surgeon, Joaquin Costa's regenerationist concept taken to the authoritarian extreme, where the army self-proclaims as the only pure institution capable of saving the nation above civilian laws. Consequences. Immediately, it meant the dissolution of the Cortes, the removal of civilian parliamentary authorities, and the establishment of the military directorate, 1923, 1925. The strategic turn regarding Morocco proposed in the text ended up leading years later to the Alhucemas landing, 1925, together with France, achieving the definitive pacification of the Rif and giving the dictatorship enormous success and stability during its first stage.
Document 2, Manifesto, published in ABC, September 14, 1923. A. Which historical event does it correspond to?
It corresponds to the official proclamation and massive dissemination of Miguel Primo de Rivera's coup d'etat to the national public opinion through the capital's press on September 14, 1923, one day after the uprising started in Barcelona.
B. Summarize its main ideas.
National salvation against corruption. It argues that military intervention is the only way to free the homeland from professional politicians, who are responsible for the misfortunes the country has suffered since the year 98. Total assumption of responsibilities. The military take control to govern directly or delegate to civilian men who strictly share their morals and doctrine. Call for discipline and submission to the king. It demands an end to indiscipline and mild rebellions, justifying violent action for the defense and honor of Spain and for the king. The text concludes with the explicit proclamation, "Long live Spain and long live the king." Establishment of the Military Inspector Directorate. It announces the formation in Madrid of a provisional directorate to maintain order and ensure the functioning of the ministries. Proposal for a new guarded government. It calls upon the country to shortly offer upright, wise, and hard-working men to form a new ministry under military protection, which will be offered to the monarch in case he deigns to accept them.
C. Develop the importance it had and its consequences.
Importance. This manifesto is crucial because it desperately seeks legitimation from the crown. Unlike other 19th century pronouncements, Primo de Rivera does not rise against the monarch, but rather assumes power for the monarch. By appealing directly to Alfonso XIII in the written text, he places the sovereignty of the state in the hands of the king's decision. Consequences. King Alfonso XIII decided not to oppose the coup, accepted the manifesto, dismissed the legitimate government of Garcia Prieto, and formally appointed Primo de Rivera as sole minister, consummating the coup d'etat. By accepting and protecting this manifesto, the Bourbon monarchy signed its own long-term death sentence. By becoming indissolubly linked to the illegal dictatorship, the subsequent failure and fall of Primo de Rivera in 1930 dragged down the legitimacy of King Alfonso XIII, precipitating the arrival of the Second Republic in 1931.
Document 3. Image of Primo de Rivera in Morocco. Which historical era does the image reflect?
It reflects the initial stage of Primo de Rivera's dictatorship, specifically the period of the military directorate, 1923 to 1925, focused on the resolution of the Moroccan War, or Rif War.
B. Which ideas stand out in the image?
Militarism and paternalism. Primo de Rivera is observed wearing field uniform, interacting face-to-face with soldiers at the front. This transmits an image of closeness, direct leadership, and control of the military situation on the ground. The prominence of the colonial problem. It makes visible the priority importance that the regime gave to resolving the bloody conflict in the Protectorate of Morocco, which devoured material resources and human lives.
Develop the importance of that image in this historical moment.
Political importance. At the beginning of his mandate, Primo de Rivera held abandonist positions, withdrawing from Morocco, which caused unease among the Africanist military, such as Franco or San Giorgio. However, after the attacks by the Riffian leader Abd el-Krim, the dictator took direct command and opted for a total offensive. This image represents that strategic turn. The Al-Husmas landing, 1/25. The dictator's personal involvement in North Africa culminated in the successful joint operation with France in the Al-Husmas landing. This military victory brought the definitive pacification of the Rif in 1927, which gave the regime enormous popularity and gigantic social prestige that consolidated the dictatorship during its early years.
Document 4. Royal Decree on the Constitution of the Military Directorate. A. Prove. Which historical event does it correspond to?
It corresponds to the legal institutionalization of the coup d'etat through the Royal Decree of September 15, 1923, published in La Gazzetta on the 16th, by which King Alfonso XIII sanctions the legal structure of the new military dictatorship.
B. Summarize its main ideas.
Concentration of power in Primo de Rivera. Miguel Primo de Rivera is appointed president of the military directorate with full executive and legislative powers, with powers to propose as many decrees as may be convenient, which will have the force of law. Dismantling of the civilian parliamentary regime. Traditional executive power positions are suppressed. President of the Council of Ministers and a civilian ministerial structure, leaving only strategic ministries for national control active. State, foreign affairs, and war, formal submission to the crown. The dictator's decisions will remain provisionally valid as long as the Cortes of the kingdom are not restored under the royal sanction, making it clear that the monarch remains the ultimate source of formal legality. C. Develop the importance it had and its consequences. Importance. This document represents the definitive triumph of the coup through its legal coverage. By signing this decree, King Alfonso XIII flagrantly violated the Constitution of 1876 that he had sworn to defend, becoming a direct accomplice to the dictatorship. Consequences. Implementation of the Military Directorate, 1923 to 1925. The country came to be governed exclusively by military personnel, replacing civilian governors with military chiefs in all provinces. End of the separation of powers. Judicial and legislative powers were subordinated to the decree-based will of the president of the directorate. Definitive loss of prestige for the crown. By linking the monarchical institution to a dictatorial regime, the subsequent fall of Primo de Rivera in 1930 would inevitably drag down King Alfonso XIII himself, opening the path for the proclamation of the Second Republic in 1931.
Document 5. Royal Decree on the Suspension of Constitutional Guarantees. A. Which historical event does it correspond to?
It corresponds to the first legal and coercive provisions of the Primo de Rivera dictatorship, issued just 4 days after the September 1923 coup d'etat. This decree reflects the real and effective demolition of the liberal rule of law of the Restoration.
Please summarize its main ideas.
Suspension of fundamental rights. Key constitutional guarantees are temporarily annulled, Articles 4, 5, 6, 9, and 13. In practice, this eliminated basic individual freedoms, such as freedom of expression, press, assembly, association, and protection against arbitrary arrests or home searches without a warrant. Militarization of provincial administration. A state of war is confirmed throughout the country, and civilian governors. The highest provincial political authorities of the previous regime are summarily dismissed, transferring total control of public order to the captains general and military chiefs. Austerity as an ideological justification. It is decreed that the salaries intended for civilian governors remain for the benefit of the treasury, attempting to demonstrate to public opinion that the new regime was eradicating superfluous spending and political clientelism to mulspennage. C. Develop the importance it had and its consequences. Importance. This document completes the transformation of the coup d'etat into a fully operational authoritarian dictatorship. It proves that Primo de Rivera did not intend to be a mere temporary mediator, but rather to dismantle the civilian and constitutional framework of 1876 to govern through military force and a perpetual state of emergency. Consequences. It led to the implementation of strict press censorship and the immediate persecution of labor leaders, anarchists, communists, and peripheral nationalisms, especially Catalanism. It consolidated the absolute control of the territory by the army through the figure of military government delegates in each judicial district, annulling the municipal and democratic life of the country.
Document 6. Image of the Civilian Directorate and Alfonso XIII. Which historical era does the image reflect?
It reflects the second stage of the dictatorship, the Civilian Directorate, 1925 to 1930. In the image, the dictator Miguel Primo de Rivera can be observed alongside the monarch Alfonso XIII, seated in the center, surrounded by the new ministers, combining military uniforms and civilian suits.
B. Which ideas stand out in the image?
The institutionalization of the regime. Following the military success at the Alhucemas Landing, 1925, Primo de Rivera decides to replace the purely military directorate with one that includes civilian technocrat politicians, such as a young José Calvo Sotelo in the treasury. The central idea is to demonstrate that the dictatorship is no longer a emergency solution, but a stable, long-term political project. The active complicity of the crown. The central position of Alfonso XIII next to Primo de Rivera visually and unequivocally ratifies the explicit support of the head of state for the dictatorship, assuming its legitimacy before the country.
Develop the importance of that image in this historical moment.
Political significance. It represents Primo de Rivera's attempt to perpetuate himself in power, drawing inspiration from the corporatist and fascist model of Mussolini's Italy. By introducing civilians and technocrats, he intended to consolidate the economic boom of the 20s through strong state interventionism, the creation of monopolies, Campsat, Telefonica, and large public works. Fatal consequence for the monarchy. The historical importance of portraying this close union between the king and dictatorial ministers was devastating in the medium term. By indissolubly linking the fate of the crown to the success of the dictatorship, the inevitable fall of the dictator in 1930 due to the economic crisis and social unrest left Alfonso XIII completely stripped of constitutional legitimacy, fostering the advent of the Second Republic in April 1931.
Document 7. Ideological Catechism of the Patriotic Union, 1928. A. Which historical event does it correspond to?
It corresponds to the phase of the peak and subsequent decline of the civilian directorate of Primo de Rivera's dictatorship. It shows the regime's effort to indoctrinate the population and create a civilian support base in the final years of the 1920s.
B. Summarize its main ideas.
Definition of the Patriotic Union, up. It is presented for propaganda purposes, not as a traditional political party associated with the corruption of the old regime, but as a citizen organization and an association of good Spaniards defined by fulfilling their moral duties, traditional values, and ultranationalism. It exalts as ideological pillars the absolute defense of national unity, personal sacrifice for the homeland, and the persecution of external and internal enemies, legitimation of the military coup. It justifies the 1923 pronouncement by calling it the Holy Rebellion of the Military Uprising, elevating the figure of Primo de Rivera to the category of savior from the immediate ruin of Spain.
Develop the importance it had and its consequences.
Importance. The Patriotic Union, originally founded in 1924, was Primo de Rivera's attempt to provide his dictatorship with a single party styled after the Italian National Fascist Party. This document, an explanatory pamphlet in the form of a catechism dated in 1928, demonstrates the regime's determination to ideologically control society through Catholic nationalism, corporatism, and the cult of the leader. Consequences. The party lacked a deep and genuine ideological foundation. It was mainly composed of landowners, oligarchs, public officials, and opportunists who joined out of convenience for social advancement, a party of hangers-on. Its failure to take root among the popular and middle classes evidenced the dictatorship's inability to create a lasting political system. When the regime began to waver due to a lack of political and university support, the Patriotic Union quickly dissolved without offering resistance, leaving the dictator in absolute political isolation before his resignation in January 1930.
Unit 12. Document 1. Speech by Manuel Azaña, 1931.
Nature of the text. We are dealing with a text of a marked political nature. It is a fragment of a speech by Manuel Azaña delivered before the Congress of Deputies in the year 1931. This coincided with the initial and constituent phase of the Second Spanish Republic. Main idea. The central thesis that articulates Azaña's entire speech is the reformulation of the so-called religious question. He presents it as a strictly political and state organization problem rather than a theological dilemma. Azaña categorically proclaims that Spain has ceased to be Catholic. He understands this not as a disappearance of faith in individual consciences, but as an irreversible socio-political and historical change. This change forces the reconfiguration of a secular state. His main goal is to justify the radical separation between church and state. This implies stripping the ecclesiastical institution of its status as the official religion and its former influence in power structures. Secondary ideas. The limitation of the religious to the private sphere. The author defends that the true religious fact belongs exclusively to the sphere of personal conscience and the intimacy of the individual, the destiny of the soul. Therefore, the state must not intervene in it. Criticism of the old state model. The role of the traditional historical state is censured. This traditional state assumed a protective role over the consciences of citizens by using coercion and the secular arm to impose faith. It did so even against the will of the souls. The redefinition of the modern state, the need to found a state structure that excludes any kind of otherworldly concern or care for doctrinal fidelity, is raised. It must act neutrally and detached from the interests of the church. Conclusion of the analysis. This fragment synthesizes the ideological core that would guide the subsequent reformist biennial. Azaña's bold statement meant a political turning point. While it aimed to modernize public institutions, it caused a deep social fracture. It wounded the sensibilities of broad Catholic sectors of the Spanish population. Consequently, it became one of the most vulnerable flanks of the Republican regime.
Document 2. Collective Declaration of the Episcopate, December 1931.
Nature of the text. We find ourselves before a text of a social, doctrinal, and testimonial character. It gathers the official position of the Spanish ecclesiastical hierarchy, the bishops, after the approval of the secular constitution in December 1931. Main idea. The argumentative core of the document is the frontal rejection, energetic condemnation, and formal protest of the episcopate against the secularism of the new constitution. The Church argues that the constitutional text lacks the minimum of respect for religious freedom. It also argues that it is inspired by a sectarian criterion. Its priority objective is to denounce the violent separation between the public and spiritual spheres. It defends that the Catholic religion is an indispensable and useful pillar both for the cohesion of human society and for the legitimacy of the political order. Secondary ideas. The denunciation of the fatal error of social exclusion. The episcopate deeply regrets that the Church is expelled from the vital areas of the nation. These areas include public laws, domestic society, family, and in a very alarming way for them, the education of youth. The challenge to institutional secularism. State secularism is qualified as absurd and unjust. This is under the theological premise that societies cannot conduct themselves morally as if God did not exist. The violation of rights. The ecclesiastical hierarchy alleges a serious contempt toward what they consider the sacred rights of the institution. They also allege the violation of the Christian conscience of the country. Conclusion of the analysis. The text is indispensable to understand the ideological counterattack against the postulates of Document 1. It stages the inevitable collision of legitimacies in the Spain of the 1930s. It shows the drive of Republican secular modernization against the resistance of a Catholic Church wounded in its traditional prerogatives. This marked the beginning of the mobilization of conservative sectors against the Republic. Document 3. Results of the elections to Cortes, June 1931. Explicit content of the document. The document is a table of official electoral data. Source: INE and EAT, corresponding to the elections for the Constituent Cortes held in June 1931. It organizes the political landscape of the moment by grouping the parties under three large ideological labels: left, center, and right, detailing for each one the spectrum of parties that compose it, their number of deputies, and their total share of votes. Main idea: the hegemony of the forces of change. The fundamental datum provided by the table is the overwhelming and unappealable victory of the leftist parties, with a total of 279 deputies and more than 2.8 million votes. This bloc, composed of the PSOE Radical Socialists, Esquerra Republicana, Acción Republicana, and the ORG, holds an absolute majority in the chamber. This result legitimizes the popular proclamation of the Republic that occurred in April of that year and grants a blank legislative check to initiate deep structural transformations. Secondary ideas. The balancing role of the center, the forces of the center, the Rus Radicals, Liga Regionalista, PNV, among others, obtain a not negligible representation of 119 deputies and 1.1 million votes, placing themselves as a key political actor that will moderate or condition the pace of political events. The collapse and retreat of the right-wing sectors, agrarians, monarchists, nationalists, suffer a severe collapse, being reduced to a marginal minority of only 41 deputies and about 650,000 votes, demonstrating the temporary discredit carried by the defenders of the old Alfonso XIII order. Historical assessment of the contents. The distribution of seats explains why the first Republican government was a center-left coalition dominated by reformist momentum, secularism, agrarian reform, military reform. However, this parliamentary map reflected a moment of initial enthusiasm that would change drastically in the elections of 1933, when the right reorganized and capitalized on social discontent, demonstrating the strong pendular polarization experienced by the Second Republic. Document 4. Articles of the Constitution of 1931. Nature of the text. We find ourselves before a text of a legal nature of the highest hierarchy. A selection of fundamental articles from the Constitution of the Second Spanish Republic, approved in December 1931, characterized by its markedly democratic, social, and secular character. Main ideas. Point 1. Foundation of a new social and democratic state model, arts. Point 1, 2, and 25. Spain is defined as a democratic republic of workers of all classes under principles of liberty and justice. The absolute equality of all Spaniards before the law is enshrined. completely abolishing any legal privilege based on nature, sex, introducing the vote and female equality, social class, wealth, birth, political ideas or religious beliefs. 2. The establishment of radical state secularism. Arts 3 and 26. It breaks with centuries of confessionalism by decreeing that the Spanish state has no official religion. Religious confessions become mere private associations, subject to a special law. The end of public funding for churches is decreed, as well as the dissolution of those orders that require a vow of obedience to an authority other than that of the state, which served as the legal framework for the dissolution and seizure of assets of the Society of Jesus. 3. Territorial decentralization and cultural recognition. Arts. Point 1, 4, and 8. The state is declared integral, but opens up for the first time to compatibility with the autonomy of municipalities and regions. Although Castilian is the official language of the state, the right and legality to use the own languages of the provinces or autonomous regions are recognized. Secondary ideas. The nationalization and redirection of properties expropriated from dissolved religious orders to be allocated strictly for charitable and educational purposes. The internal restructuring of the territory through municipalities grouped into provinces as a basis for building autonomous regions. Synthesis. The articles represent the legal embodiment of Azaña's reformist speeches, Document 1. It meant an immense legislative advance regarding civil rights and territorial organization, but the harshness of Article 26 regarding the Church raised alarms among the Catholic opposition described in Document 2, turning the Magna Carta itself into a text of confrontation instead of consensus. Document 5. Historical photograph in La Coruña, 1932. Description and identification of the scene. The photograph shows a snapshot taken on April 14, 1932, in La Coruña during an official act commemorating the first anniversary of the proclamation of the Second Republic. The image possesses an extraordinary documentary value due to the significance of the figures who coincide in it. Essential contents and key figures. Manuel Azaña in the center. The figure of Manuel Azaña stands out preeminently, who at that time served as President of the Government and Minister of War. Azaña appears as the political embodiment of the reformist biennial and the main promoter of the democratization of the armed forces and the secular state. Santiago Casares Quiroga on the left. Casares Quiroga is identified in a close-up, a prominent Galician Republican politician who held the position of Minister of the Interior in Azaña's cabinet and who would later be president of the government when the war broke out. Francisco Franco in the background. The element most charged with symbolism and historical tension is the presence, immediately to Azaña's left, from the viewer's perspective, slightly behind, of General Francisco Franco. Franco wears the military uniform and watches with a circumspect look. Interpretation of the background and historical significance. The interest of the image lies in gathering in the same frame the antagonistic leaders who will embody the two sides of the future Spanish Civil War. 1936–1939. Franco's presence in La Coruña is due to Azaña's own military reforms. After the closure of the General Military Academy of Zaragoza, directed by Franco, and closed by the Republic due to misgivings about its republicanism, Franco was stationed as chief of the infantry brigade in Galician lands. The photograph perfectly illustrates the apparent institutional normality of 1932, where a predominantly conservative military establishment, personified by a Franco who at that time maintained an ambiguous and prudent posture, not joining, for example, the Señorjada of August of that year, formally subordinated itself to the Republican civil power of Azaña before social polarization and the coup d'état of July 1936, broke that balance definitively.
Unit 13. Document 1. Manifesto of General Franco, July 17, 1936.
The main idea of this political document is the explicit justification of the coup d'état against the Second Republic, accompanied by a direct call for the mobilization and enlistment of members of the Army and the Navy to take up arms in defense of the homeland. The author seeks to legitimize the military insurrection by presenting it as a mandatory response of national salvation in the face of inaction by the Republican public authorities. As secondary ideas, the arguments used by Franco to portray the supposedly irreversible downfall of Spain stand out, denouncing a state of anarchy and absolute disorder that prevailed across most of the countryside and towns. Likewise, governmental authorities are accused of passivity and even of encouraging social revolts and labor conflicts. Another key secondary idea is the implicit mention of pistolerismo, gun violence, and political assassinations through the allusion to citizens who murder one another treacherously and with malice aforethought, which directly references the climate of social tension reflected in deaths like those of Lieutenant Castillo and the right-wing leader José Calvo Sotelo. Finally, the text secondarily exalts the values of nationalist patriotism, the sacralization of the unity of Spain, and the recognition of the military establishment as the sole pillar capable of imposing order, peace, and justice.
Document 2. Comparative images of both sides.
The main idea of this iconographic document, composed of 2 photographs, is to show the radical opposition between the organizational, ideological, and operational realities of the 2 opposing sides at the beginning of the Civil War, with both compositions serving as potent tools of political propaganda. Regarding the secondary ideas of the photograph on the left, corresponding to the Republican side in Madrid on July 18, 1936, it illustrates the improvisation and spontaneous popular response to the military uprising through the distribution of rifles to ununiformed civilians by the government of José Giral. It highlights the enthusiasm and determination of the popular militias to defend republican legality, which initially slowed down the success of the coup d'état and made resistance in the capital possible, though secondarily it highlights the lack of hierarchy, discipline, and technical military order that would ultimately plunge the industrial zone into chaos and hinder its effectiveness at the front. Conversely, the secondary ideas of the photograph on the right capture the reality of the insurgent Spain in Burgos, where Generals Franco and Mola are observed surrounded by military commanders and civil guards in regulatory uniforms. This image visually transmits the concepts of authority, formal discipline, institutional hierarchy, and military order under a single command. It symbolizes the consolidation of the professional core of the uprising in the north of the country, which structured the conflict from a purely military and doctrinal perspective that would shape their subsequent victory in the conquest campaigns.
Document 3. Proclamation of General Mola in Navarre, July 19, 1936.
The main idea of this legal military text is the official declaration of a state of war throughout the territory of the province of Navarre by General Emilio Mola, decreeing the immediate militarization of all security forces with the explicit objective of overthrowing the institutions of the Second Republic by force of arms. As secondary ideas, it points out, first of all, the historical justification for military interventionism, arguing that the army feels compelled to act in a messianic manner to fulfill the desire for order felt by most citizens, in line with the tradition of 19th century Spanish pronunciamientos, military coups. Secondly, it emphasizes in a secondary manner the imperative need to restore the absolute principles of authority and substantial public order, eliminating political division and the polarization of civil society. Finally, another crucial secondary idea is the establishment of a punitive and relentless institutional violence as a method of control, explicitly warning that the authority will impose exemplary punishments with maximum speed, seriousness, and without any kind of hesitation or wavering, in order to terrorize the opposing population and secure control of Navarrese territory.
Document 4. Decree number 255 of Unification, April 1937.
The main idea of this decree issued by General Franco is the forced political unification of the main ideological currents supporting the military uprising, obligatorily integrating the Spanish Falange and the Carlos Riquetes into a single political entity of a national and totalitarian nature, under his absolute and unquestionable leadership. The secondary ideas of the document revolve around the strategic need to subordinate any individual or collective action of Spaniards to a common goal to ensure efficient government action within the wartime context. Franco argues secondarily that, given the progress of the war and the proximity of victory, it is urgent to shape the institutional foundations of the new state and settle the thinking of the so-called national revolution. It is added secondarily that this process does not constitute a coalition of parties or a temporary government union, but rather a permanent single-party structure that pays tribute to the heroes and martyrs of the nationalist side, of keeping open the possibility of restoring the traditional secular monarchical regime in the future as the historical system that forged the greatness and unity of the country.
Document 5. The Siege of Madrid and the No Pasaran.
The main idea of this graphic document is the visual depiction of the fierce resistance and ideological mobilization of the population of Madrid, during the intense bombardments and the Francoist military siege that took place between November 1936 and March 1937, praising the defense of the capital as the crucial bastion of the Republican cause. As secondary ideas, one perceives the propagandistic simplification of the conflict by the sectors defending constitutional legality, who define the contest exclusively as a heroic international struggle against aggressor fascism, deliberately omitting any reference to the tensions and the internal social revolution process that the Republican rearguard was undergoing. The emblematic slogan on the banner, "No passaran, they shall not pass," originally coined in government circles and popularized by the communist leader Dolores Ibárruri, functions as a secondary idea aimed at boosting combat morale and structuring the militia resistance. Likewise, the secondary slogan, "Madrid will be the tomb of fascism," evidences the enormous international dimension of the Spanish War, showing how the conflict was interpreted by world public opinion as the direct and inevitable prologue to the ideological and armed clash that would trigger World War II in Europe.
Document 6. Propaganda. Poster of the Phalange.
The main idea of this poster is the exaltation of the fascist ideology of the Phalange Española de las Llanes and the civil and military mobilization of its members in favor of the insurgent side during the conflict. It seeks to project an image of dynamism, youth, and social regeneration aimed at building the new state that General Franco intended to establish. As secondary ideas, one can distinguish the use of the identitarian symbology of the Phalangist Party, highlighting in the background the large red and black flags with the emblem of the yokes and arrows, which would constitute the pillars of the aesthetic trappings of the dictatorship. On the iconographic plane, the men depicted wear the Phalangist blue shirt, carry military weapons, and march with a determined attitude, which symbolizes paramilitary discipline and the suppression of individuality in favor of the collective destiny of the nation. Furthermore, the Roman or fascist salute with the raised arm performed by one of the figures on the right accentuates the doctrinal proximity of the movement to totalitarian regimes such as those of Hitler and Mussolini. Finally, the detail of holding up a young child symbolizes the generational replacement and the will to forge a new Spain based on the social directives of the Fuero del Trabajo, labor charter, and the vertical syndicates.
Document 7. Poster of the Delegated Defense Council of Madrid.
The main idea of this image is the strategic need to institutionalize the war effort in the Republican zone through the creation of the Popular Army, seeking to unify the different fighting forces under formal military discipline to overcome the initial chaos and inefficiency of the militias of the unions and working-class parties. As secondary ideas, the central allegory presiding over the composition stands out, representing the Republic wearing a mural crown and opening her arms in a gesture of protection and institutional validation. In the foreground, a peasant holding a sickle and a formally uniformed soldier holding a rifle shake hands, symbolizing the indispensable alliance between the rural proletariat, the workers, and the state apparatus for collective defense. The slogan inscribed at the bottom, which indicates that the Popular Army is the army of the Republic, reinforces the secondary idea of centralization of state power driven decisively by President Juan Negrin and backed by the communists. This policy sought to subordinate the social revolution to the imperative demands of the front and to eradicate the duality of powers represented by the autonomous committees.
Document 8. Propaganda posters during the Civil War.
The main idea of this double document is to illustrate the massive use of posters as a central piece of psychological warfare of attrition, clearly reflecting the social polarization and the ideological rift that divided the two opposing blocs. In the poster on the left, belonging to the Republican side and published by the Anarchist Union (CNT), the secondary idea is the exaltation of the peasant and industrial revolution initiated as an immediate popular response to the military uprising. The image secondarily shows a worker in a triumphant attitude raising a rifle over the date of July 19, 1936, symbolizing the enthusiasm of the revolutionary dual power, the delivery of weapons to the workers' militias, and the collectivization of lands that marked the first months in regions like Aragon and Catalonia. In the poster on the right, belonging to the Francoist rearguard, the secondary idea is the sacralization of the conflict under the doctrinal concept of a Catholic crusade. A large cross-shaped structure is shown with monumental lettering referencing the crusade, driving down into a cracked globe accompanied by an inscription that positions Spain as the spiritual guide of the world. This iconographic composition represents the theological justification provided by the Spanish Church in its 1937 pastoral letter, legitimizing Franco's military coup as a holy war against Marxist infidels and Republican secularism.
Document 9. Official portrait of General Franco.
The main idea of this official propaganda painting is the glorification of Francisco Franco as the absolute leader, unquestioned caudillo, and generalissimo of the armies, symbolically concentrating the entirety of the military and institutional power of the new regime in his own person. As secondary ideas, there is a clear exaltation of militarism as the foundational basis of the post-war authoritarian regime. Franco is depicted in a dominant foreground, dressed in a gala military uniform that includes a conspicuous fur collar and official medals, underscoring the prestige he gained in the Moroccan campaigns and the military victory over the Republic. In the background of the painting, a compact mass of combatants and a dense accumulation of national flags and military banners are secondarily deployed, aiming to symbolize the unanimous support and the mandatory unification decreed in 1937 of all political sectors aligned with the uprising. Finally, the dynamism of the troops and the presence of warplanes in the sky secondarily evoke the concepts of discipline, strength, order, and totalitarian authority that characterized the institutionalization process of the personal Francoist dictatorship.
Document 10. Collective letter of the Spanish Episcopate on the war, July 1st, 1937.
Main idea. The ecclesiastical hierarchy justifies and institutionalizes the civil conflict, presenting it as an armed plebiscite of a dual and doctrinal nature, where the Church takes an explicit side with the insurgent faction, considering the conflict an inevitable struggle for the survival of the faith, religion, and traditional civilization. Secondary ideas. The outcome of the February 1936 elections is delegitimized, claiming that the national government granted an arbitrary victory to revolutionary forces that did not reflect the reality of the ballot boxes. The text simplifies the war as a clash between two irreconcilable tendencies, a spiritual one embodied by the insurgents in defense of the homeland, order, and religion, and a materialist one, Marxist, communist, or anarchist, allied with the Russian-Soviet model. The impossibility of the Church remaining indifferent is argued due to the enormous material and human damage suffered in people, property, and rights, and the suppression of God in the opposing zone.
Document 11. Decree number 255 of Unification, April 19, 1937.
Main idea. Forced political unification is decreed in the insurgent zone through the merger of the Spanish Falange and the Carlist Requetes into a single-party entity under the absolute leadership of Francisco Franco, with the aim of building the institutional foundations of the new state. Secondary ideas. The text justifies the measure based on wartime demands, arguing that efficient government action requires subordinating any individual or collective initiative to a common destiny. It is emphasized that this single party does not constitute a temporary coalition or a passing conglomerate of forces, but rather a permanent structure legitimized in the name of the fallen, heroes, and martyrs. The possibility of restoring the traditional secular monarchical regime in the future is introduced as the historical system backing the unity and greatness of the country.
Document 12. Causes of the War in Spain, Manuel Azaña, 1939.
Main idea. The original legitimacy of the Second Republic is defended as a regime established peacefully to give voice to the democratic aspirations of the people, arguing that the state had an urgent obligation to intervene actively to correct the brutal socio-economic inequalities and structural backwardness of the country. Secondary ideas. The text denounces the violent contrasts of Spanish society, contrasting the high standard of living in urban centers with the extreme poverty of rural villages frozen in the 19th century. The unequal distribution of agricultural property is detailed, pointing out the problem of unproductive smallholdings, minifundismo, in the Northwest, and the serious problem of large estates, latifundismo, in the South and West, where a single owner possessed thousands of hectares. The drama of chronic unemployment in the countryside and the inhumane conditions of agricultural laborers are exposed, whose livelihood depended on minimum wages and prolonged periods of forced inactivity during the year.
Document 13. Rules for the Primary School, May 6, 1939.
Main idea. A national Catholic and authoritarian educational model is implemented to completely eradicate the heritage of the secular Republican school, using classrooms as an apparatus for political, religious indoctrination and cult worship, around the figure of the caudillo after the end of the war. Secondary ideas. The mandatory presence of religious and political symbols in the school space is decreed through the immediate reinstatement of the Holy Crucifix and the presence of Franco's portrait next to an image of the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception. The daily life of students is militarized and ritualized through mandatory ecclesiastical greetings, Hail Mary Most Pure, and daily patriotic ceremonies like raising and lowering the national flag to the sound of the anthem. Social control and forced attendance of children and teachers at Sunday religious services are established under the supervision of the regime's youth organizations.
Document 14. Historical photograph in the room.
Main idea. The documentary image captures the official meeting and handshake between the dictator Francisco Franco and the leader of Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler, highlighting the political, diplomatic, and military alignment existing between the new post-war Spanish regime and the totalitarian Axis powers. Secondary ideas. The shared militaristic aesthetic of both leaders is visually reflected as they appear dressed in regulatory uniforms, peaked caps, and official medals that enhance the principle of military authority and hierarchy. The composition documents the presence of high-ranking military commanders in the background, illustrating the importance of direct military diplomacy in the context of international relations during World War II.
Unit 14. Document 1. Allegory of Franco and the Crusade, Arturo Reque Kemmer.
The document is a primary source of an artistic and iconographic nature. It is a fragment of the mural Allegory of Franco and the Crusade, located in the Basilica of the Valley of the Fallen. Description of the elements. The scene places the figure of the dictator Francisco Franco in the center, characterized in an anachronistic way as a medieval crusader, dressed in armor, a cape, and holding a sword between his hands. Around him, arranged in a hierarchical and reverential way, are the different groups that made up the coup bloc that won the Civil War: Carlist combatants, Forcatis, soldiers of the Army of Africa, Moroccan regulars, phalangists, and members of the clergy, a friar, all of them under the superior protection of the equestrian figure of the Apostle St. James. Political and ideological meaning. The content of the fresco responds to the regime's need to articulate a powerful cult of personality around the dictator, comparable to that of other contemporary European totalitarian leaders, fascism and Nazism, elevating him to the category of a providential caudillo. The concept of crusade. The image sacralizes the Civil War, stripping it of its nature as a civil conflict to present it as a crusade of national liberation in defense of the Christian faith against communism and the Reds. It faithfully reflects national Catholicism, the doctrinal base of the regime where church and state merge to legitimize each other.
Document 2. Fragment of the Charter of the Spaniards, July 18, 1945.
We find ourselves before a primary source of a political legal nature. It is a fragment of the Charter of the Spaniards, one of the fundamental laws of the kingdom, promulgated on a symbolic date, the anniversary of the national uprising. Main idea. The document seeks to provide the Francoist regime with an apparent charter of citizen rights and duties to camouflage or make up its dictatorial and fascist character. This legal maneuver was a priority in 1945, coinciding with the imminent defeat of the Axis powers in the Second World War, in order to offer a facade of legal institutionalization, making mention of concepts like Cortes, guarantees, or participation of the people in the face of foreseeable international isolation. Secondary ideas. Analysis of the articles. The preamble and art, 2. They establish the absolute submission of the individual toward the state. Patriotism is defined not as a right, but as an obligation subordinated to loyalty to the head of state, and obedience to the laws emanating from the personal power of the caudillo. Art. 12. False freedom of expression. Freedom to express ideas is stated in a theoretical way, but it is immediately nullified by introducing a restrictive clause, provided they do not attack the fundamental principles of the state. The right remains map-bound and subject to the official ideology. Art. 33. Limit of rights. It explicitly states that no citizen right is absolute. All remain conditioned and limited by the safeguarding of the spiritual, national, and social unity of Spain. Conclusion. The internal contradiction of the text, granting a right only to restrict it immediately afterward in the same statement, demonstrates that it is not a safeguarding constitution but rather a dictatorial instrument, where the government reserved the power to suspend guarantees by decree.
Document 3. Organic Law of the State, January 10, 1967.
The text is a primary source of a legal and constitutional character. It is Article 6 of the Organic Law of the State, LOE, of 1967, the last of the major fundamental laws approved during Francoism. Main idea. The central idea of the article is the institutionalization and legal consecration of the personal dictatorship, legally sanctioning the absolute concentration of all powers of the state in the figure of Francisco Franco. The text discards any democratic principle of separation of powers or popular sovereignty. Secondary ideas. Sovereignty delegated to the leader. By establishing that the head of state personifies national sovereignty, citizen sovereignty is eliminated. The nation does not express itself at the ballot box, but instead becomes subsumed and subordinated to the decisions of the dictator. Accumulation of powers. The text breaks down the functions of the caudillo in detail, combining political and administrative leadership, executive power, the capacity to sanction and promulgate laws, legislative power, control of the judiciary, justice is administered in his name, and supreme command of the armed forces. Leadership of the national movement. His status as leader of the national movement, the single party, FETY de los Jones, is made explicit. This shields political monolithism, banning a pluralism of parties and linking the permanence of the state to the ideological postulates of the regime, guarantor of order and continuity. The dictator is defined as the person in charge of ensuring public order and guaranteeing the survival of the dictatorship for the future, preparing the succession mechanism.
Document 4. Photograph of Franco taking communion.
The document consists of a primary source of an iconographic and photographic nature that captures an official political religious act during the dictatorship. Description of the elements. The image shows the dictator Francisco Franco, dressed in his military uniform, in a posture of religious submission, kneeling while receiving the sacrament of the Eucharist from the hands of a member of the high ecclesiastical hierarchy. The surroundings are crowded with bishops and priests dressed in solemn liturgical vestments. Central idea. Providential legitimation of power. The content of the image visually captures the strategy of divine legitimation used by Francoists. By showing the supreme ruler subordinated before the Catholic ritual, the propaganda message transmitted was that Franco was not an ordinary civil or military ruler, but a leader chosen by divine providence to save Spain. Representation of national Catholicism. The photograph perfectly illustrates the concept of national Catholicism and the absolute symbiosis between the Catholic Church and the Francoist state. The Church provided the essential moral and ideological support to unite society and justify the lack of democratic freedoms, while the regime returned the favor by financing the clergy, granting them absolute control over education and public morality, and restoring all the privileges lost during the Second Republic.
Unit 15. Document 1. Communique by Adolfo Suárez on the draft. Law for Political Reform, September 10, 1976.
This excerpt from a speech broadcasted on radio and television by the President of the government, Adolfo Suárez, in September 1976, constitutes a primary source of a political narrative nature, whose purpose was to present the draft law for political reform, LRP, to the citizenship. The central idea of the document is the articulation and defense of this law as the definitive legal tool to dismantle the dictatorial structures of Francoism and initiate the transition toward a democratic system. The core objective of Suárez is to announce a profound structural change that will be executed from law to law, meaning by employing the very reform mechanisms of the dictatorship's fundamental laws to ensure that the Francoist Cortes would approve their own peaceful dissolution, avoiding a traumatic rupture or a power vacuum. As secondary ideas, the speech introduces an absolute doctrinal shift by explicitly proclaiming that national sovereignty resides in the people, returning political legitimacy to the citizens after 40 years of dictatorship. Likewise, the text makes a direct appeal to suffrage. It is necessary to get the people to speak as soon as possible, by means of the vote, which anticipated the strategy of submitting the law to a national referendum in December 1976 and calling the first free general elections. Finally, Suarez defends pluralism by suggesting the need to give real legitimacy to groups and parties, laying the foundations for the subsequent legalization of opposition political forces and consolidating the culture of dialogue that would define this period.
Document 2. Composition of the Congress of Deputies after the 1977 elections.
This statistical table is a primary source of a political institutional character that details the distribution of seats in the Congress of Deputies after the first democratic elections held in Spain on June 15, 1977, called following the approval of the law for political reform. The fundamental reading of the data reveals the majoritarian triumph of moderate options and the birth of an imperfect bipartisanship in the Spanish political map. The electorate gave overwhelming support to the Union of the Democratic Center, UCD, the coalition led by the then-president Adolfo Suarez, which obtained 165 deputies. Although Suarez consolidated his position at the head of the executive, he fell just short of the absolute majority, set at 176 seats, which would force him to inaugurate a stage of minority government based on constant pacts. Position as a second force and undisputed leader of the opposition was Felipe González's PSOE with 118 deputies, achieving a very clear hegemony within the left. On the other hand, the data shows the marginalization of the most polarized stances. Santiago Carrillo's PCE obtained a modest result of 20 deputies, despite the enormous impact that its legalization had in April of that year, while Alianza Popular AP, led by the former Francoist minister Manuel Fraga, suffered a severe setback by achieving only 16 seats, evidencing society's rejection of neo-Francoist theses. Finally, the statistical table confirms the emergence of peripheral Catalan and Basque nationalist forces, PDC, PNV, turning territorial articulation into one of the great debates of the process. These results granted the Cortes full democratic legitimacy to act de facto as constituent Cortes tasked with drafting the 1978 Constitution.
Document 3. Signatories of the Moncloa Pacts, October 25, 1977.
The photograph is a primary source of an iconographic character that records the signing of the Moncloa Pacts in the autumn of 1977. The scene shows a long negotiation table occupied by the main political forces that emerged from the elections of June of that same year, visually immortalizing the birth of the politics of consensus as the engine of the transition. In the shot, an atmosphere of relaxation and cooperative dialogue can be appreciated among leaders of radically opposed ideologies. The fundamental content of the image is the staging of a historic double agreement, political and economic, to save the institutional stability of the country. Seated at the table are figures representing the entire parliamentary spectrum of the constituent Cortes. From the right wing of Alianza Popular, Manuel Fraga, to the left wing of the PCE, Santiago Carrillo, passing through the president of the government, Adolfo Suarez, from the UCD, the PSOE, Felipe González, the PNV, Juan Adriaguera, or the Catalan minority, Miquel Roca. The real background addressed by the document is the unified response of the political class face-to-face with the suffocating economic crisis derived from oil, which threatened to derail the democratic process with a runaway inflation of 30% and massive unemployment. Through the stabilization program designed by Minister Enrique Fuentes Quintana, the political forces assumed harsh fiscal and wage adjustment measures in exchange for political and social modernization counterparts, tax reform, decriminalization of adultery, freedom of the press, converting this agreement into the socio-economic pillar that smoothed the path toward the future drafting of the Constitution.
Document 4. Communists celebrate the legalization of their party in April 1977.
The document is an iconographic primary source showing the explosion of joy and street celebrations of the militants of the Communist Party of Spain, PCE, immediately after the announcement of its move to legality on April 9, 1977. The snapshot captures a crowd cheering, raising their arms, and symbolically tossing garments or flags into the air, reflecting the end of nearly 40 years of underground existence, persecution, and exile during the Francoist dictatorship. The crucial political significance of this image lies in the fact that it illustrates one of the most audacious, risky, and decisive steps taken by the government of Adolfo Suarez to guarantee the international credibility of the transition. The legalization of the party led by Santiago Carrillo was decreed surprisingly during Holy Saturday, taking advantage of the holiday void to neutralize the predictable and frontal opposition from the hardest sectors of the army and the Francoist bunker, who considered communism their historical enemy. Suarez assumed that general elections celebrated without the participation of the communist current would lack true democratic legitimacy. As a counterpart to its legalization, the PCE pragmatically accepted the reformist rules of the game, committing itself to abide by the parliamentary monarchy and the bicolor flag, which meant the integration of the revolutionary left into the constitutional pact, and definitively conjured the danger of a violent rupture in the country.
Document 5. Preamble of the 1978 Constitution.
The text is a primary source of a legal political nature, corresponding to the formal preamble of the Spanish Constitution of 1978, sanctioned by King Juan Carlos I after being approved by the Cortes and ratified by the citizenship in the referendum of December 6. The central idea of the document is the solemn doctrinal break with the previous autocratic regime and the proclamation of popular sovereignty as the foundation of the new legal order. The text makes it explicit that the supreme norm emanates directly from the will of the Spanish nation, with the primordial goal of building an advanced democratic society under the protection of a rule of law. As secondary ideas, the preamble condenses the great aspirations and transversal ideals that guided the consensus of the transition. It establishes a normative framework that guarantees a peaceful, just democratic coexistence subjected to the rule of law, ensures the protection of Spain's identity plurality by safeguarding human rights, cultures, institutions, and the distinct traditional languages of the state, laying the foundations for subsequent regional development, and seeks social cohesion through the promotion of economic progress to ensure a dignified quality of life. Lastly, it consecrates the insertion of Spain into the international sphere through peaceful cooperation with the rest of the peoples of the world.
Document 6. Drafting Committee of the 1978 Draft Constitution.
The photograph is an iconographic primary source portraying the work of the parliamentary committee designated by the constituent Cortes to draft the blueprint of the Magna Carta, whose members went down in history with the nickname of the Fathers of the Constitution. The image shows the legislative work table in a concentrated and deliberative atmosphere. The essential content of the image is the faithful reflection of the politics of consensus carried to its highest institutional expression. In the committee, composed of 7 deputies, it was possible to blend and balance the weight of the diverse, legitimate political currents emerging from the ballot boxes of 1977 to draft a common text acceptable to the vast majority of the country. The governmental and centrist current was represented by Gabriel Cisneros, Miguel Herrero y Rodriguez de Miñón, and José Pedro Pérez Lorca, belonging to the UCD. The socialist wing was embodied by Gregorio Peces Barba, representing the PSOE. The spectrum of the communist left counted on the presence of Jordi Solé Tura for the PCE-PSUC. The theses of the conservative right were defended by Manuel Fraga Iribarne for Alianza Popular, and the sensitivity of moderate peripheral nationalisms was represented by Miquel Roca i Junyent on behalf of the Pacte Democratique per Catalunya. The historical relevance of the photograph lies in documenting the mechanism by which the historical defect of Spanish constitutionalism of the 19th and 20th centuries was avoided, which had been characterized by partisan Magna Cartas imposed by one faction over another. By sitting down at the same table communists, nationalists, conservatives, and socialists, an integrative lasting text with a broad social base was brought to light.
Document 7. Excerpt from the Spanish Constitution of 1978, Articles 97, 98, and 101.
The text is a primary source of a legal constitutional character. It contains Articles 97, 98, and 101 of Title IV of the 1978 Constitution, which formally delimit the competencies, structure, and dissolution mechanisms of the executive power in the Kingdom of Spain. The central idea of the excerpt is the establishment of a normative framework for the government of the nation, which is not relegated to a mere executor of parliamentary dictates, but is defined as an autonomous political organ with broad civil and military state leadership function. The articles consolidate the architecture of a parliamentary monarchy based on the strict division of powers and popular sovereignty. The detailed analysis of the provisions reveals the following secondary specifications. Article 97 breaks down the competencies of the executive, granting it exclusivity in the direction of domestic and foreign policy, the leadership of civil administration, and the armed forces, in addition to assigning it regulatory power. Article 98 structures the internal composition of the cabinet, president, vice presidents, and ministers, and designs a parliamentary model with a march presidential character, stipulating that it is the president who directs and coordinates the action of the government and imposing a strict regime of economic incompatibilities. Finally, Article 101 regulates the termination of the government's functions, linking it directly to the conclusion of legislative periods, general elections, to the loss of parliamentary confidence, motion of no confidence or question of confidence, or to personal circumstances of the leader of the executive, resignation or demise, guaranteeing institutional continuity by maintaining the outgoing government in office until the formal handover.
Unit 16, Document 1, Inaugural Speech of Felipe González, December 1st, 1982.
This fragment of the inaugural speech of the leader of the PSOE, Felipe González, before the Congress of Deputies, constitutes a primary source of a political narrative nature of enormous historiographical significance. The socialist victory by absolute majority in the elections of October 1982 is interpreted by specialists as the milestone that seals the culmination and consolidation of the Spanish transition. The central idea of the text is the affirmation of the stability of the constitutional order through the consummation of peaceful alternation in power. González underlines that the result of the ballot boxes endows the new executive with an unquestionable democratic legitimacy to enforce the law against any immovable redoubt. As secondary ideas, the text breaks down a firm defensive commitment against backward-looking attempts, intentos involucionistas, an explicit warning directed at sectors of the military establishment that yearned for the previous regime. With a fresh memory of the 23F coup in the arena of foreign policy, the speech positions full integration into the European Communities (EEC) as unpostponable goals of the term, understood as the definitive seal of international democratic approval for the country. It also announces a rigorous restudy of the terms of military cooperation with the United States and the controversial accession to NATO carried out by the previous UCD cabinet, maintaining the commitment to submit said permanence to the direct verdict of the citizenry.
Document 2, Storming of Congress by Lieutenant Colonel Tejero, February 23, 1981.
This famous snapshot, captured in the chamber of the Congress of Deputies, constitutes a primary source of an iconographic character that records the attempted coup d'état of February 23, 1981. 23F. In it, one observes in the center frame the Lieutenant Colonel of the Civil Guard, Antonio Tejero, erupting pistol in hand onto the podium of the Parliament. Meanwhile, civil guards armed with assault rifles guard the room, and deputies remain crouched in their seats to protect themselves from the initial bursts of gunfire. The essential content of the image is the visual embodiment of the moment of greatest institutional vulnerability of the Spanish transition. The violent assault aimed to kidnap the executive and legislative powers to impose an authoritarian political regression in Union Politique that would nullify the reforms of the UCD and restore the structures of Francoism. The coup plan took advantage of a moment of temporary and government weakness. Just as the investiture session of Adolfo Suárez's successor, the centrist Leopoldo Calvo Sotelo, was taking place. The image symbolizes the rejection by the most fundamentalist sectors of the military establishment, the bunker, toward the legalization of the PCE, the decentralization of the autonomous state, and the apparent state weakness in the face of ETA's bloody terrorist campaign.
Document 3 and Document 4, Results of the General Elections of October 1982.
The ultimate failure of the coup attempt, due to the decisive televised intervention of King Juan Carlos I denouncing the rebels, ended up transforming this tragic event into the catalyst that strengthened civil commitment to the Constitution of 1978. These two statistical tables, coming from official data of the Ministry of the Interior and the Central Electoral Board, constitute primary sources of a political institutional nature that detail the voting percentages and the subsequent distribution of seats in the Cortes after the general elections of October 28, 1982. The central idea thrown by the analysis of both tables is the historic triumph by absolute majority of the PSOE, which rises with 202 deputies in Congress, representing 50% of the chamber with 40% of the popular vote, and a comfortable majority of 134 senators. This massive stream of votes buried the previous political map and granted Felipe González an incontestable parliamentary control to deploy his ambitious program of reforms and state modernization. As secondary ideas, the statistical data certify the definitive collapse of the UCD, the party that had steered the transition, which collapsed dramatically to retain barely 12 parliamentary seats due to its sharp internal divisions in the split of Adolfo Suárez's CDS. In parallel, the tables show the concentration of the conservative vote in the Alianza Popular (AP) coalition of Manuel Fraga, which consolidates itself as the new reference force of the opposition with 106 seats. Finally, one can appreciate the electoral retreat of the PCE, which falls to 4 seats, and the stable maintenance of the main regional nationalist forces from Catalonia, CDU, and the Basque Country, PNB.
Document 5. Autobiographical Reflection of Adolfo Suarez, 1985.
This text of a testimonial and evocative character, written by former President of the government Adolfo Suarez in 1985, represents a primary source of a political narrative character in which the operational keys of the regime change in Spain are evaluated. The matrix idea of the document is the defense of the transition model as a peaceful, legal, and unprecedented institutional metamorphosis. Suarez defends that the dismantling of the authoritarian dictatorship to build the democratic state was done deliberately from the existing legality. A vertiginous transition executed without traumas, power vacuums, or social revanchism, achieving a methodological milestone in contemporary political science. Regarding secondary ideas, the former leader recalls the deep-rooted climate of anxiety and the persistent collective fear that gripped Spanish society in 1976 before the ghost of a reenactment of the Civil War. He justifies that the audacity, serenity, and speed applied by his cabinet were indispensable to deactivate the predictable reactions of the unyielding sectors of the army and the Francoist state apparatus, which still monopolized enormous shares of power. Lastly, he highlights that the core success of the process lay in the majority ratification by the Spanish people, who validated the project democratically through the ballot boxes.
Document 6. Institutional Portrait of the President of the Government of the Democratic Monarchy.
This photograph constitutes a primary source of an iconographic and testimonial character that immortalizes a historic meeting of the first 4 presidents of the government of Spain under the headship of state of King Juan Carlos I. In the upper row appear, standing, Felipe González, PSOE, Adolfo Suarez, UCD, sharing a gesture of relaxation, and Leopoldo Calvo Sotelo, UCD, while in the central position, seated, figures José María Aznar, PP. The fundamental content and symbolic value of the image lie in the visual staging of full democratic normalization and the solidity of state institutions. The snapshot captures the meeting on a plane of equality and institutionality of leaders belonging to antagonistic political traditions, socialism, reformist centrism, and conservatism, evidencing the deep roots of the principle of peaceful alternation in the leadership of the executive. The image visually signs the closing of the secular deficit of civil stability that Spain's contemporary history had dragged, historically characterized by the resort to military uprisings or the exclusion of the political adversary.
Document 7. Inaugural Speech of José María Aznar, May 3, 1996.
This fragment of the inaugural speech delivered by José María Aznar before the Congress of Deputies constitutes a primary source of a political narrative nature that inaugurates the stage of governments of the Partido Popular, PP. After 14 uninterrupted years of socialist mandates, the central idea of the document is the proclamation of a new stage of democratic renewal and institutional modernization based on the political alternation promoted by the electorate in the elections of March 3, 1996. Aznar interprets the verdict of the ballot boxes as an explicit citizen demand to transform political behaviors, regenerate the way power is exercised, and solve the pending problems of the country. As secondary ideas, the text analyzes with pragmatism the political landscape derived from the elections. The Partido Popular has emerged as the majority option in the Cortes, but lacks an absolute majority in the Congress of Deputies. From this arithmetical premise, the candidate deduces and assumes the obligation to structure the term upon the pillars of the culture of agreement, cultura del pacto, compromise, and dialogue with other political formations. This speech posture prepared the ground for the parliamentary governance pacts that the PP had to formalize with moderate regional nationalisms, singularly with Jordi Puig's CU through the Majestic Pact, the PNV, and the Canary Coalition, to secure the viability of the new executive.